what if I told you the reason witches were burned wasn't about magic at all? The real cause was far darker, rooted in politics, power, and economic chaos. Stick around, because the shocking truth will change everything you thought you knew about the witch trials and why they mattered more than just superstition. For centuries, the image of witches being dragged to the stake, accused of cackling evil and casting curses, has haunted our collective imagination. We picture terrified villagers trembling before a blazing fire as the accused screamed their innocence or confessed under torture, all because of some irrational fear of the supernatural. But what if I told you that story is only half the picture? That the flames that consumed those women and men were stoked by far more human and far more sinister fires? This documentary aims to peel back the layers of myth and legend to reveal the real forces behind one of history's darkest chapters: the witch burnings of early modern Europe and colonial America. You might be surprised to learn that those terrifying trials were never just about witches or magic. Instead, they were about control. Control of minds, lands, wealth, and society itself. Imagine a time when Europe was gripped by upheaval. Political power was shifting in seismic ways. Religious institutions were locked in fierce battles to maintain their influence. Economic hardship was squeezing communities to breaking point. Into this volatile mix, accusations of witchcraft became a weapon, a tool wielded by those in power to silence dissent, grab property, or simply explain the unexplainable chaos around them. In this opening chapter, I want to set the stage for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about the witch trials. We'll explore the political maneuverings behind the persecutions, the economic incentives that fed them, and the social tensions that exploded into violence. And we'll meet the real victims, not just the accused witches, but the communities shattered by fear and manipulation. So, why were witches really burned at the stake? To answer that, we need to look beyond the smoke and flames and into the very heart of early modern society. The popular narrative paints the witch trials as a kind of mass hysteria born from superstition, villagers terrified of dark magic, religious zealots hunting heresy, and a general fear of the unknown. Certainly, superstition and fear played their parts. But historians and researchers have uncovered a far more complex and disturbing picture. Take, for instance, the political dimension. Across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, monarchs and ruling elites were consolidating power in ways that often felt threatening to local communities. In many cases, witch trials were used by those in authority to stamp out opposition or eliminate inconvenient rivals. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a quick way to discredit them, justify their removal, and send a chilling message to others who might challenge the status quo. One striking example is how witch hunts often targeted socially vulnerable groups: the poor, the elderly, women who lived alone, or those who did not fit neatly into the social order. These individuals became scapegoats during times of political turmoil or social unrest. Their persecution served to distract from deeper conflicts, channel public anger, and reinforce the power structures that benefited from division. Religious institutions, too, played a pivotal role. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation had plunged Europe into religious wars and doctrinal battles. The Church, seeking to maintain its moral authority, saw witch hunts as a way to root out supposed heresy and enforce conformity. Clergy often led or encouraged trials, framing witchcraft as a dire threat to the spiritual and social fabric of communities. But religion was only one piece of the puzzle. Economic factors were equally, if not more, critical drivers of the witch trials. In periods of economic hardship or transition, witch hunts surged. Regions suffering from poor harvests, famine, or the fallout of changing trade patterns often saw spikes in accusations. Why? Because witchcraft accusations were frequently tied to property disputes, wealth redistribution, and land grabs. Imagine a poor widow who owns a small farm, suddenly accused of witchcraft by neighbors who covet her land. Or a prosperous farmer who, under the guise of rooting out evil, seizes the property of those convicted. In many cases, the trials were less about purging evil spirits and more about seizing tangible assets. This economic angle is crucial in understanding why witch hunts were so widespread and devastating. They were not random acts of madness, but calculated moves within a broader struggle for survival and power. To truly appreciate the full scope of these trials, we'll also explore how societal tensions between genders, classes, and communities exploded into violence. Women, who made up the majority of those accused, were often scapegoated for broader anxieties about gender roles and social order. The witch became a symbol of female rebellion or deviance, a convenient target for patriarchal control. But these accusations didn't only silence women. They tore apart families, communities, and entire regions. Fear spread like wildfire, neighbor turning against neighbor, as trust dissolved and paranoia reigned. Let me paint a vivid picture. Imagine a small village in the 1600s, nestled in the rolling hills of Central Europe. A poor harvest has left the villagers hungry and desperate. The local lord, intent on securing his grip on the land, turns a blind eye as accusations of witchcraft begin to fly. Neighbors accuse one another, the widow with no children, the midwife who knows too much, the old man who mutters strange words. Fear swells, and before long, the accused are dragged to a public square. The air is thick with smoke and tension as a pyre is built. The crowd watches in silence, or sometimes with grim satisfaction as the flames rise. But beneath this terrifying scene lies a web of motives. The Lord's desire for land, the church's push for control, the neighbor's jealousy and fear, the desperate need to find a scapegoat for their suffering. The witch is less a figure of evil magic and more a casualty of human ambition and anxiety. So, what will you learn in this documentary? By the end, you'll understand how political ambitions and religious dogma combine to create a perfect storm for witch hunts, why economic hardship and property disputes were at the core of many accusations, the social dynamics that made vulnerable groups easy targets, the devastating human cost, and how these trials were about far more than just superstition. You'll hear from leading historians and experts who have pieced together this story from trial records, economic data, and contemporary accounts. You will see how what seemed like isolated acts of cruelty were in fact part of a larger pattern, a dark chapter of history that reveals the dangerous intersections of fear, power, and greed. As we journey through this documentary, keep this image in mind. The witch trials were not simply about superstition or fear of the occult. They were about real people caught in the crossfire of political intrigue, economic desperation, and social upheaval. In uncovering the real reasons why witches were burned, we confront uncomfortable truths about power and persecution that still resonate today. It reminds us to question the narratives we are told, to look beyond appearances, and to understand the complex forces that drive societies to violence. So join me as we delve into the shadows of history, unraveling the tangled motives behind the witch trials. Together, we will discover that the flames that consumed the witches' bodies were kindled by the darker fires of human ambition, fear, and greed, a lesson as relevant now as it was centuries ago. Welcome to The Real Reason Why Witches Were Burned. It's not what you think. Let's begin. To understand why witches burned, we must first understand the economic landscape that made such horrors possible. The period of the Great European Witch Hunts, roughly spanning from 1450 to 1750, coincided with one of the most dramatic economic transformations in human history. This was no coincidence. Europe in the late medieval and early modern period was undergoing a seismic shift from feudalism to early capitalism. Traditional economic structures that had governed life for centuries were crumbling, leaving communities vulnerable, desperate, and looking for someone to blame. Into this economic chaos stepped the figure of the witch, not as a supernatural threat, but as an economic scapegoat whose persecution could solve very real financial problems. The most direct economic incentive for witch persecution was property confiscation. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their assets, land, houses, livestock, money, and personal possessions were typically seized by the state, the church, or local authorities. This wasn't some incidental byproduct of justice. It was a driving force behind many accusations. Consider the case of Katharina Kepler, mother of the famous astronomer Johannes Kepler, who was accused of witchcraft in 1615 in Württemberg, Germany. The charges against her arose partly from a property dispute with a neighbor who coveted her small plot of land. Had she been convicted and executed, her property would have been forfeit. Only her son's influence and legal expertise saved her from the flames, but her case illustrates the economic underpinnings of many witch trials. The pattern was repeated across Europe with chilling consistency. In France, the property of convicted witches was split between the crown and local officials, creating a perverse incentive structure. In some German territories, witch hunting became so profitable that it was essentially industrialized. The Prince Bishop of Wurzburg, Julius Ector, oversaw trials that resulted in over 300 executions between 1626 and 1631, with the confiscated property helping to fund his lavish court and ambitious building projects. But the economic motives went deeper than simple greed. The transition from feudalism brought with it new concepts of private property and individual ownership that were fundamentally at odds with older, communal ways of life. Common lands that had been used collectively for generations were being enclosed and privatized. Traditional rights to gather wood, graze animals, or draw water were being eliminated. Women, particularly widows, who held property rights under older customs, found themselves vulnerable as these new economic systems took hold. The witch hunts served as a brutal mechanism for accelerating this economic transformation. By targeting those who represented older ways of life, often elderly women who remembered and clung to traditional customs, the hunts cleared the way for new economic arrangements. The stakes weren't just about individual property. They were about reshaping entire economic systems. Agricultural communities were particularly vulnerable to these pressures. The period of the witch hunts coincided with the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that brought harsh winters, shorter growing seasons, and repeated crop failures. Famine was a constant threat. In such circumstances, communities desperately sought explanations for their suffering. The figure of the witch provided a convenient scapegoat, someone who could be blamed for failed harvests, dead livestock, and economic hardship. But blaming witches wasn't just about finding psychological comfort. It was about finding economic solutions. When a community identified a witch and executed her, they weren't just eliminating a supposed supernatural threat. They were redistributing her resources to the community. Her land could be divided among neighbors, her livestock sold to pay for community needs, her house repurposed. The witch trial became a form of disaster capitalism, a way of using crisis to justify economic redistribution. The timing of witch hunts often coincided precisely with economic crises. In England, witch trials peaked during periods of economic hardship, particularly in the 1640s during the English Civil War, when traditional economic relationships were in chaos. In Scotland, the major witch hunts of the 1590s and 1660s coincided with harvest failures and economic disruption. This wasn't coincidence but causation. Economic crisis created the conditions in which witch hunts could flourish. The role of debt was particularly crucial. In a pre-modern economy where money was scarce and credit informal, Debt relationships were personal and often fraught with tension. A widow who couldn't pay what she owed, a tenant who fell behind on rent, a trader who defaulted on obligations. These economic relationships gone wrong often transformed into witchcraft accusations. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a way of eliminating a debt, claiming collateral, or removing an economic rival. The witch hunts also reflected changing attitudes toward poverty and social welfare. Medieval Christianity had generally viewed caring for the poor as a religious duty, with monasteries and churches providing social services. But the Protestant Reformation dismantled many of these institutions, while new economic thinking began to view poverty as a moral failing rather than a circumstance deserving compassion. The figure of the witch, often a poor, elderly woman dependent on community charity, became a target of this new economic morality. The rise of mercantilism and early capitalism brought with it new forms of economic competition and anxiety. Merchants worried about trade rivals, craftsmen feared losing customers, farmers competed for markets. In this environment of heightened economic insecurity, witchcraft accusations became a tool of economic warfare. Accusing a competitor of witchcraft was a way of eliminating business rivals while cloaking economic motives in moral and religious language. The legal system itself became complicit in this economic predation. Courts that convicted witches often benefited financially from confiscated property. Judges, clerks, and court officials received fees and payments that increased with the number of convictions. This created a feedback loop where successful witch hunts generated resources that funded more witch hunts. Justice became literally profitable. The scale of this economic predation was enormous. In some regions of Germany, entire villages saw their wealth concentrated in the hands of a few through witch trials. The Franconian region, which experienced some of the most intense witch hunts in Europe, saw massive transfers of property from accused witches to authorities and neighbors. Historian Wolfgang Behringer estimates that in some areas, up to 10% of the population was executed for witchcraft, with their property redistributed among survivors. Women were particularly vulnerable to economic predation through witch accusations because of their precarious legal and economic status. Widows who inherited property disrupted patriarchal expectations about wealth transmission. Single women who owned businesses or land challenged assumptions about female economic dependence. Women healers and midwives who earned independent incomes threatened emerging male-dominated medical professions. The witch hunt became a way of reasserting economic control over women who had achieved some measure of financial independence. The international scope of witch hunts also reflected economic factors. Regions that were economically marginal or transitional experienced more intense persecution than stable, prosperous areas. The German states, fragmented and economically unstable, saw some of the worst witch hunts in Europe. In contrast, economically stable regions like Venice or the Netherlands experienced relatively few witch trials. Economic stability provided some protection against the hysteria. But perhaps most importantly, the economic motives behind witch hunts were rarely acknowledged explicitly. They were always cloaked in religious and moral language, presented as necessary for spiritual purification and community safety. This disguised the fundamentally predatory nature of the enterprise and made it psychologically easier for communities to participate in what was essentially organized theft and murder. The economic foundations of witch persecution reveal a disturbing truth. The burning of witches was often less about supernatural fears and more about very earthly greed. Communities facing economic hardship found in witch hunts a way to redistribute resources, eliminate debts, and remove economic competitors. The flames that consumed the accused were fueled not just by superstition, but by the cold calculations of economic advantage. Understanding these economic motives doesn't diminish the horror of what happened, but it does help explain why witch hunts were so widespread and persistent. They served concrete economic functions in societies undergoing dramatic transformation. The witch hunt was, in many ways, a form of primitive capitalism, a violent mechanism for concentrating wealth and eliminating those who stood in the way of economic change. As we move forward in our investigation, we'll see how these economic motives intertwined with religious, political, and social factors to create the perfect storm that consumed tens of thousands of innocent lives. The story of witch burning is ultimately a story about power, who had it, who wanted it, and what they were willing to do to get it. Chapter 3: Religious Power and the Sacred Economy. The relationship between religious authority and witch persecution runs far deeper than simple theological concern about heresy or devil worship. To understand why witches burned, we must examine how religious institutions used accusations of witchcraft to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and maintain economic control during one of the most turbulent periods in Christian history. The timing of the great European witch hunts is crucial. They began in earnest around 1450, peaked between 1580 and 1650, and gradually declined by 1750. This period coincides almost exactly with the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation, when Christianity was fragmenting into competing denominations, each fighting for survival and supremacy. In this context, witch hunts became a weapon in the arsenal of religious warfare. The Catholic Church's approach to witchcraft was codified in 1484 with Pope Innocent VIII as papal bull, Summus Desiderantus Effectibus, which authorized two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, to pursue witches in the Holy Roman Empire. This led to the publication in 1487 of the Malleus Maleficorum, the Hammer of Witches, which became the handbook for witch persecution across Europe. But the Malleus was more than a theological treatise about devil worship. It was a manual for social control that reinforced church authority while providing practical instructions for identifying, prosecuting, and eliminating those who threatened the established order. The text explicitly states that questioning the existence of witches is itself heretical, a brilliant, rhetorical move that made criticism of witch hunts tantamount to questioning church doctrine. The economic implications were clear. The church positioned itself as the sole authority capable of identifying and combating supernatural threats. This created a monopoly on spiritual protection that translated into real political and economic power. Communities that wanted protection from witches had to submit to church authority, pay for religious services, and accept ecclesiastical jurisdiction over moral and social matters. The Protestant Reformation complicated this picture, but didn't eliminate religious motivation for witch persecution. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin were equally convinced of the reality of witchcraft, but they used witch hunts to serve different purposes. For Protestants, witch persecution became a way of demonstrating moral purity and rejecting Catholic superstition while simultaneously showing their own commitment to biblical literalism. In Protestant regions, witch hunts often targeted practices associated with Catholicism, the use of religious images, prayers to saints, or traditional healing rituals that seemed too close to Catholic sacraments. The famous Salem witch trials in Massachusetts were fundamentally about Puritan anxieties over maintaining religious purity in a frontier environment where traditional church controls were weakened. But both Catholic and Protestant witch hunts shared a common feature. They were efforts to control popular religion and eliminate competing forms of spiritual authority. Throughout medieval Europe, Christianity had coexisted with various forms of folk religion, healing traditions, seasonal rituals, beliefs in protective spirits, and practices that blended Christian and pre-Christian elements. These traditions were often maintained and transmitted by women, particularly those who served as healers, midwives, and wise women in their communities. The witch hunts provided a mechanism for eliminating these alternative spiritual authorities and consolidating religious power in the hands of official church hierarchies. Women who practiced traditional healing were rebranded as witches consorting with demons. Seasonal festivals that celebrated agricultural cycles were condemned as sabbats where witches gathered to worship the devil. Folk remedies and protective charms were reclassified as malevolent magic. This religious consolidation had clear economic benefits for church institutions. By eliminating traditional healers, the church enhanced the monopoly of university-trained and church-affiliated physicians. By suppressing folk religious practices, official clergy became the only legitimate intermediaries between the community and the supernatural. By controlling accusations of witchcraft, church authorities gained enormous leverage over local populations. The role of confession in witch trials illustrates how religious and economic motives intertwined. Under torture, accused witches were forced to confess not only to their own supposed crimes, but to name accomplices. These forced confessions created an expanding network of accusations that could target anyone who had challenged church authority, failed to pay religious taxes, or practiced alternative forms of spirituality. The confiscation of property from convicted witches often benefited religious institutions directly. In many regions, the church received a portion of confiscated assets, creating a direct financial incentive for prosecution. Monasteries and churches funded their operations through witch trials, turning persecution into a form of religious taxation. The theological framework of witch persecution also served to reinforce hierarchical social relationships that benefited religious elites. The Malleus Maleficorum argued that women were particularly susceptible to demonic temptation because of their weaker rational faculties and stronger sexual appetites. This theological misogyny provided religious justification for the economic and social subordination of women, while positioning male clergy as naturally suited to spiritual authority. The emphasis on sexual elements in witch confessions, sabbats involving orgies with demons, the devil's sexual seduction of witches, the use of sexual acts in magical rituals, served multiple purposes. It titillated audiences while simultaneously reinforcing the church's authority over sexual behavior and family relationships. By controlling sexuality through the threat of witchcraft accusations, religious authorities extended their power into the most intimate aspects of human life. The international scope of witch persecution reveals how religious competition intensified the phenomenon. Catholic and Protestant regions competed to demonstrate their superior devotion by pursuing witches more aggressively. The Habsburg territories, strongholds of Catholic orthodoxy, experienced some of the most intense witch hunts as local authorities sought to prove their religious loyalty. Similarly, Protestant regions like Scotland and parts of Germany used witch persecution to establish their reformed credentials. The decline of witch hunts in the late 17th and early 18th centuries coincided with the exhaustion of religious warfare and the emergence of more stable denominational boundaries. As Catholic and Protestant churches settled into coexistence, the need to demonstrate superior devotion through witch persecution diminished. Religious authorities also began to recognize that witch hunts could threaten their own power by creating chaos and undermining legal institutions. But the religious legacy of witch persecution extended far beyond the formal end of trials. The theological framework that justified burning witches, the belief in an active devil, the emphasis on female spiritual weakness, the association of nonconformist behavior with demonic influence continued to shape Christian thought and practice. These ideas provided the foundation for later forms of religious persecution and social control. The economic impact of religious witch persecution was enormous. Entire regions saw their economies disrupted by trials that removed productive community members while enriching church institutions and their allies. The human capital lost through witch persecution, particularly the destruction of traditional medical knowledge, maintained by female healers, had long-term consequences for public health and economic development. Understanding the religious dimensions of witch persecution requires recognizing that pre-modern religious institutions were not primarily spiritual organizations, but complex political and economic entities. Churches controlled vast amounts of property, collected taxes, administered legal systems, and provided social services. The theological language of witch persecution masked what were fundamentally struggles over political and economic power. The sacred economy of witch persecution reveals how religious authority could be weaponized to serve very earthly purposes. By claiming divine sanction for their actions, religious elites could pursue economic and political goals while maintaining moral legitimacy. The figure of the witch became a convenient tool for eliminating enemies, consolidating resources, and reinforcing hierarchical relationships. This religious framework also provided psychological comfort for communities participating in persecution. By framing witch killing as a sacred duty, religious authorities made it easier for ordinary people to participate in what was essentially organized murder. The theological language of salvation and purification masked the brutal reality of economic predation and social control. As we examine the religious foundations of witch persecution, we see how spiritual authority and temporal power reinforced each other in a system that devastated communities while enriching elites. The flames that consumed accused witches were lit not just by religious zeal, but by the calculated pursuit of power disguised as devotion. The sacred and the economic were never truly separate in the world that burned witches. Understanding this integration helps explain why witch persecution was so persistent and widespread. It served too many different interests to be easily abandoned. The great witch hunts of early modern Europe occurred during a critical period of state formation and political consolidation. Far from being merely religious or popular phenomena, witch trials were sophisticated instruments of statecraft, used by emerging national governments, ambitious nobles, and local authorities to build power, suppress dissent, and create unified political identities. To understand why witches burned, we must examine how accusations of witchcraft served the political ambitions of those who wielded power. The timing of witch hunts reveals their political function. The period from 1450 to 1750 saw the transformation of medieval Europe as fragmented feudal landscape into the early modern state system. This process was violent and contested, involving the centralization of authority, the suppression of local autonomy, and the creation of new forms of political loyalty. Witch hunts provided a mechanism for advancing these goals while cloaking political ambitions in moral and religious language. Consider the case of France under King Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign from 1643 to 1715 saw the consolidation of absolute monarchy. While France experienced relatively few witch trials compared to the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, those that occurred were carefully orchestrated to serve royal authority. The Affair of the Poisons, 1677 to 1682, though focused on court intrigue rather than rural witchcraft, demonstrated how accusations of magical conspiracy could be used to eliminate political rivals and reinforce royal power. More typical was the experience of the Holy Roman Empire, where political fragmentation created intense competition between rival authorities. In this environment, witch hunts became weapons in political warfare. The Prince-Bishop of Wurzburg, Julius Ector von Muspelbrunn, used witch trials in the 1590s not just to enforce religious orthodoxy, but to consolidate territorial control and eliminate rivals within his domain. The over 300 executions he oversaw helped establish his authority while providing resources through property confiscation. Similarly, the Prince-Bishop of Bamberg, Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim, conducted even more extensive witch hunts between 1626 and 1631. His campaigns resulted in approximately 1,000 executions and served multiple political purposes, demonstrating loyalty to Habsburg Catholic policies, eliminating Protestant sympathizers, and concentrating wealth and power in episcopal hands. The witch hunts became a tool of both religious and territorial consolidation. The political utility of witch accusations extended beyond high-level statecraft to local governance. Town councils, village magistrates, and regional administrators found witch trials useful for managing social tensions and reinforcing their authority. When communities faced economic hardship, social unrest, or challenges to established hierarchies, witch hunts provided a way of redirecting discontent while demonstrating official competence and moral leadership. The legal framework of witch trials reveals their political function. Unlike other crimes, witchcraft was typically tried under exceptional procedures that suspended normal legal protections. Accused witches could be held indefinitely, tortured for confessions, and convicted on evidence that would be inadmissible in other cases. These exceptional procedures weren't accidental, but served to demonstrate the extraordinary power of political authorities. The involvement of trained lawyers and professional judges in witch trials shows their importance to state building. Rather than being left to mob justice or religious courts, witch trials were increasingly conducted by secular authorities using new legal procedures. This represented the expansion of state judicial power into areas previously governed by custom, religion, or local tradition. The geographic patterns of witch persecution reveal political motivations. Border regions, contested territories, and areas with weak central authority experienced the most intense witch hunts. The Spanish Netherlands, contested between Habsburg Spain and emerging Dutch independence, saw extensive witch trials as different authorities sought to establish legitimacy. Similarly, Scotland's intense witch hunts coincided with periods of political instability and contested sovereignty. The role of royal and princely courts in promoting witch persecution demonstrates elite political involvement. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, personally participated in witch trials and wrote extensively about witchcraft in his Daemonologie, 1597. His obsession with witches was not merely personal, but served to reinforce royal authority by positioning the monarch as defender against supernatural as well as earthly threats. James's approach reveals how witch persecution could serve emerging theories of divine right monarchy. By claiming special ability to detect and combat witches, rulers positioned themselves as divinely appointed protectors of their people. The witch hunt became a demonstration of royal virtue and supernatural authority, reinforcing political claims through religious and magical language. The international dimension of witch persecution also served political purposes. Catholic and Protestant rulers used witch hunts to demonstrate religious orthodoxy and compete for papal or imperial favor. The Habsburg territory's extensive witch persecution served to prove Catholic loyalty and secure continued support from Rome and Vienna. Protestant regions used their own witch hunts to demonstrate reformed piety and independence from Catholic influence. Military conflict intensified political uses of witch persecution. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, saw some of the most extensive witch hunts in European history, as competing authorities used accusations of witchcraft to identify enemies, justify confiscations, and maintain control over devastated populations. Witch trials became part of the war effort, serving military and political objectives alongside religious ones. The role of political informants and spies in witch trials reveals their intelligence function. Accused witches under torture were forced to name accomplices and describe Sabbath gatherings, providing authorities with networks of alleged conspirators. These forced confessions created detailed maps of supposed opposition that could guide further political action. The witch trial became a mechanism for political surveillance and control. Local political rivalries often drove witch accusations. Town council elections, guild disputes, and conflicts between secular and religious authorities frequently culminated in witchcraft charges against opposing factions. The trial of Katharina Henna in Cologne, 1627, illustrates this pattern. Her prosecution served the political ambitions of certain city council members while eliminating a prominent family from local politics. The use of witch trials to eliminate political opposition was often systematic rather than opportunistic. Lists of suspects were carefully compiled, targeting individuals who had opposed specific policies, challenged particular authorities, or belonged to disfavored factions. The appearance of supernatural threat masked what were essentially political purges. The economic benefits of witch persecution served political objectives by providing resources for state building. Confiscated property could fund military campaigns, administrative expansion, and building projects that demonstrated political power. The Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg used witch trial proceeds to construct impressive Baroque buildings that showcased episcopal authority. The role of professional witch hunters reveals the bureaucratization of persecution for political purposes. Figures like Matthew Hopkins in England or the various inquisitors in German territories were not spontaneous folk heroes, but professional agents serving political masters. Their activities were funded, directed, and coordinated by authorities seeking specific political outcomes. The decline of witch hunts in the late 17th and early 18th centuries coincided with the stabilization of political boundaries and the emergence of more effective state institutions. As rulers developed alternative means of controlling populations, standing armies, professional bureaucracies, systematic taxation, the need for witch persecution as a tool of political control diminished. But the political legacy of witch persecution extended beyond formal trials. The framework of emergency powers, exceptional legal procedures, and state surveillance developed during witch hunts provided precedents for later forms of political control. The idea that extraordinary threats justify extraordinary measures became embedded in European political culture. The international spread of witch persecution to colonial territories reveals how it served imperial political purposes. The Salem witch trials in Massachusetts occurred during a period of political instability and imperial reorganization, when colonial authorities sought to demonstrate their competence and loyalty to London while managing local tensions. Understanding the political dimensions of witch persecution reveals how accusations of supernatural crime could serve very earthly purposes. The witch hunt provided a mechanism for building state power, eliminating opposition, and creating political unity through shared fear and moral purpose. The flames that consumed accused witches were lit not just by superstition, but by calculated political ambition. This political framework helps explain why witch persecution was so persistent and widespread. It served too many different political interests to be easily abandoned. Central authorities used it to build state power, local officials used it to manage communities, and rival factions used it to eliminate competition. The witch became a versatile tool of political manipulation. The political manipulation behind witch trials reveals uncomfortable truths about the relationship between power and justice. When authorities can define certain individuals or groups as existential threats requiring elimination, normal legal protections become obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be upheld. The witch hunt created a template for political persecution that extended far beyond its original context. As we examine the political foundations of witch persecution, we see how the pursuit of power could transform communities into killing grounds, while maintaining the appearance of moral and legal legitimacy. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in later periods of political persecution and social control. The overwhelming majority of those accused and executed for witchcraft were women, Estimates suggest between 75% and 85% of all witch trial victims were female. This stark gender imbalance was not coincidental, but reveals one of the most important dimensions of witch persecution: its role in enforcing patriarchal control and suppressing female autonomy during a period of significant social change. To understand why witches burned, we must examine how accusations of witchcraft serve to maintain and reinforce gender hierarchies. The gendered nature of witch persecution becomes clear when we examine who was accused and why. The typical victim was a woman who had transgressed social boundaries in some way. She might be a widow, living independently, a healer practicing traditional medicine, a woman involved in economic disputes, or simply someone who had acquired a reputation for being quarrelsome or outspoken. These women were vulnerable not because they posed any real supernatural threat, but because they challenged patriarchal expectations about female behavior and social roles. The theological framework underlying witch persecution was deeply misogynistic. The Malleus Maleficarum, the most influential handbook of witch persecution, argued explicitly that women were more susceptible to demonic influence than men because of their supposedly weaker rational faculties, stronger sexual appetites, and greater moral instability. This theological misogyny provided religious justification for targeting women while positioning male authorities as naturally suited to identify and combat witchcraft. But the gendered persecution of witches served purposes that went far beyond theological theory. The early modern period saw significant challenges to traditional gender roles and patriarchal authority. Economic changes created new opportunities for female independence, while religious upheaval disrupted traditional institutions of social control. Demographic catastrophes like plague and war created numerous widows who inherited property and lived outside direct male supervision. The witch hunt provided a mechanism for reasserting patriarchal control over women who had gained some measure of autonomy. Consider the economic dimensions of gendered persecution. Women accused of witchcraft were disproportionately likely to be property owners, widows who had inherited from deceased husbands, single women who had acquired assets through their own labor, or women involved in commercial activities. The confiscation of property from convicted witches served to return female-controlled resources to male hands while eliminating women who had achieved economic independence. The case of Alice Samuel, executed in 1593 during the War Boys witch trials in England, illustrates this pattern. Samuel was an elderly woman of some means who became involved in a property dispute with the Throckmorton family. Her prosecution and execution not only eliminated a troublesome neighbor, but also resulted in the confiscation of her property, which was redistributed among male relatives and neighbors. The role of women as traditional healers made them particularly vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. Throughout medieval Europe, women had served as the primary providers of medical care, using knowledge of herbal remedies, midwifery techniques, and healing practices passed down through generations of female networks. This traditional female knowledge represented a challenge to emerging male-dominated medical professions and formal medical institutions. The witch hunts provided a mechanism for eliminating this competition, while discrediting female medical knowledge as demonic. Women healers were reframed as witches who used their knowledge to harm rather than heal, consorting with demons to obtain their remedies. The prosecution of wise women and cunning folk destroyed centuries of accumulated medical knowledge while clearing the way for university-trained, exclusively male physicians to monopolize medical practice. The targeting of midwives was particularly significant, as these women played crucial roles not only in childbirth but in broader community health and social networks. Midwives were often the first to recognize signs of domestic violence, illegitimate pregnancy, or other family secrets that challenged patriarchal authority. Their elimination through witch persecution removed potential witnesses to male misconduct while reinforcing male control over female reproduction. The sexual dimensions of witch persecution reveal its role in controlling female sexuality and reinforcing male dominance. Confessions extracted from accused witches almost invariably included detailed descriptions of sexual encounters with demons, participation in orgiastic Sabbath gatherings, and the use of sexuality in magical practices. These sexual elements served multiple purposes. They titillated audiences while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that uncontrolled female sexuality was inherently dangerous and demonic. The emphasis on the devils as sexual seduction of women positioned male sexual desire as a supernatural threat, while absolving human men of responsibility for sexual misconduct. Women who accused men of sexual assault could find themselves facing counter-accusations of witchcraft, with their alleged demonic seduction used to explain away male behavior. The witch trial became a mechanism for controlling discourse about sexuality while reinforcing male sexual prerogatives. The community dynamics of witch accusations often reflected gender tensions and conflicts. Women who challenged male authority, competed with men economically, or threatened established gender hierarchies became vulnerable to accusations from neighbors, relatives, or community leaders. The witch trial provided a socially acceptable way of eliminating troublesome women while maintaining the appearance of moral and legal legitimacy. The role of other women in making accusations reveals the complex ways patriarchal systems could turn women against each other. Some of the most damaging testimony against accused witches came from other women, neighbors who competed for resources, younger women challenging older female authority, or women seeking to protect themselves by deflecting suspicion. The witch trial created a dynamic where female solidarity became dangerous, and survival might depend on participating in the persecution of other women. The international variations in gendered persecution reveal different approaches to maintaining patriarchal control. In some regions, accusations focused on older women who no longer served reproductive functions and were seen as economically burdensome. In others, younger women who challenged sexual norms or marriage expectations became primary targets. These variations reflected different strategies for managing female autonomy within patriarchal frameworks. The family dynamics of witch persecution often centered on conflicts over inheritance, marriage arrangements, and household authority. Stepmothers were particularly vulnerable to accusations from stepchildren seeking to eliminate competition for inheritance. Daughters-in-law could face accusations from mothers-in-law in conflicts over household management. Wives might be accused by husbands seeking to escape unwanted marriages or claim complete control over family resources. The legal framework of witch trials reinforced gender hierarchies through procedures that specifically disadvantaged women. Female testimony was given less weight than male testimony. Women had fewer legal protections, and the use of torture was often more severe for female defendants. The search for devil's marks on womenless bodies became a form of sanctioned sexual assault that reinforced male authority over female bodies. The role of male authorities in prosecuting witches, judges, clergy, political officials, reveals how formal institutions reinforced gendered persecution. These men were not merely responding to popular pressure, but actively promoting witch hunts as a means of maintaining male-dominated hierarchical systems. Their involvement gave witch persecution the institutional support necessary for sustained campaigns against female autonomy. The protection offered to some women through male patronage reveals the relational nature of patriarchal systems. Women connected to powerful men, wives of nobles, daughters of wealthy merchants, women under clerical protection were less likely to face accusation. This differential protection reinforced the idea that female safety depended on male approval and supervision, rather than inherent rights or legal protections. The decline of witch persecution in the late 17th and early 18th centuries coincided with changes in gender relations and family structures that provided alternative mechanisms for patriarchal control. The emergence of more formal legal systems, changes in property law that restricted female inheritance, and new ideologies of domesticity that confined women to private spheres reduced the need for witch persecution as a tool of gender control. But the legacy of gendered witch persecution extended far beyond formal trials. The association of female power with evil, the suspicion of women living independently, and the idea that uncontrolled female sexuality was inherently dangerous became embedded in European culture. These ideas continue to influence gender relations and provide justification for restricting female autonomy long after the last witch was burned. The gendered dimensions of witch persecution reveal how accusations of supernatural crime could serve to maintain very earthly systems of male dominance. The flames that consumed accused witches were fueled not just by superstition, but by the systematic effort to control female autonomy and maintain patriarchal authority during a period of social change. Understanding the gender dynamics of witch persecution helps explain why the phenomenon was so persistent and widespread. It served the interests of male-dominated institutions while providing a mechanism for individual men to eliminate troublesome women. The witch hunt created a template for gendered persecution that could be adapted to different contexts and purposes. This gendered framework also reveals how systems of oppression could disguise themselves as moral and religious imperatives. By framing the persecution of women as necessary for spiritual and social protection, patriarchal authorities could pursue very earthly goals of control and domination while maintaining legitimacy and even popular support. The witch trials of early modern Europe were not chaotic outbursts of popular hysteria, but carefully orchestrated legal proceedings conducted within formal judicial systems. However, these legal frameworks were systematically corrupted to ensure conviction rather than justice, creating institutional machinery for persecution that operated under the guise of legitimate law. To understand why witches burned, we must examine how legal systems were perverted to serve political, economic, and social goals rather than truth and justice. The legal foundation for witch prosecution was established through a series of papal bulls, imperial decrees, and statutory laws that redefined witchcraft from a relatively minor offense to a capital crime requiring extreme measures for prosecution. The papal bull Sumus Desiderantis Effectibus, 1484, authorized inquisitors to pursue witches with extraordinary powers, while secular authorities across Europe enacted laws that made witchcraft punishable by death and created special procedures for its prosecution. The most influential legal text was the Malleus Maleficarum, which provided detailed instructions for identifying, prosecuting, and convicting witches. This manual established legal precedents that were adopted by courts across Europe, creating a standardized approach to witch prosecution that ensured high conviction rates. The Malleus argued that witchcraft cases required exceptional procedures because the crime was both particularly heinous and difficult to prove through ordinary means. These exceptional procedures systematically undermined legal protections that existed for other crimes. Accused witches could be held indefinitely without bail, denied access to advocates or legal counsel, and subjected to interrogation techniques that would be illegal in other cases. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of legal systems, was effectively reversed for witchcraft accusations. The burden was on the accused to prove their innocence rather than on prosecutors to prove guilt. The use of torture in witch trials represents one of the most significant corruptions of legal procedure. While torture existed in other legal contexts, it was employed more systematically and extensively in witchcraft cases than in virtually any other type of prosecution. The justification was that witches were unlikely to confess voluntarily due to their diabolic allegiance, making torture necessary to extract truth. In practice, torture was used to create evidence rather than discover it. The techniques of torture employed in witch trials were sophisticated and designed to break down resistance while creating detailed confessions that supported prosecution narratives. The strappado, thumb screws, leg screws, and other devices were applied systematically to force accused witches to admit not only to their own supposed crimes, but to name accomplices and describe Sabbath gatherings. These forced confessions then became evidence in subsequent prosecutions, creating expanding networks of accusations. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about dreams, visions, or supernatural encounters, represented another significant departure from normal legal standards. In most criminal cases, courts required physical evidence or eyewitness testimony about actual events. But in witchcraft prosecutions, witnesses could testify about supernatural visitations, demonic apparitions, or magical attacks that left no physical trace. This spectral evidence was often the primary or only evidence used to secure convictions. The role of confession in witch trials reveals how legal procedures were manipulated to serve predetermined outcomes. Unlike other crimes where confessions needed to be voluntary and consistent with known facts, witch trial confessions were often extracted through torture, coached by interrogators, and accepted even when they contained impossible or contradictory elements. The content of confessions was less important than their existence as proof of guilt. The judicial personnel involved in witch trials were often financially motivated to secure convictions. Judges, clerks, torturers, and other court officials received fees that increased with the number of prosecutions and convictions. This created a direct financial incentive for corruption and ensured that courts would actively seek out witchcraft cases rather than discourage them. Justice became a profit-making enterprise. The case of Benedict Karpzov, a Saxon judge who presided over thousands of witch trials in the early 17th century, illustrates this judicial corruption. Karpzov claimed to have personally signed over 20,000 death sentences, primarily for witchcraft, and was celebrated as a great legal scholar and defender of Christian society. His approach to witch trials combined scholarly legal analysis with systematic use of torture and acceptance of spectral evidence, creating a template for learned judicial persecution. The appeals process in witch cases was typically either non-existent or corrupted in favor of conviction. Higher courts that might normally review death sentences often deferred to local authorities in witchcraft cases or applied the same corrupted standards that had produced initial convictions. The few successful appeals typically occurred when powerful patrons intervened rather than through normal legal procedures. The destruction of court records in many witch trials suggests deliberate efforts to conceal the extent of judicial corruption. Unlike other legal proceedings, witch trials often left incomplete or destroyed documentation, making it difficult to verify procedures or appeal decisions. This systematic destruction of evidence protected officials from later scrutiny while eliminating traces of their methods. The international transmission of corrupted legal procedures through scholarly networks helped spread witch persecution across Europe. Legal scholars who specialized in witchcraft law traveled between courts, sharing techniques and precedents that maximized conviction rates. This created a professional community of witch prosecutors who refined and systematized the corruption of legal procedure. The role of university-trained lawyers in witch persecution challenges common assumptions about legal education and professional ethics. Many of the most systematic witch prosecutors were learned lawyers who used their legal expertise to create more effective persecution methods. Legal scholarship on witchcraft focused on overcoming procedural obstacles to conviction rather than ensuring fair trials. The economic structure of witch prosecutions created systematic incentives for corruption. In many regions, the costs of trials were paid through confiscated property of convicted witches, creating a self-funding mechanism that encouraged extensive prosecutions. Officials who conducted more trials and secured more convictions received greater compensation, while those who acquitted defendants or conducted brief proceedings received less. The use of professional accusers and witnesses in witch trials reveals the commodification of evidence and testimony. Some individuals made careers out of identifying witches and testifying in trials, receiving payment for their services while moving between different jurisdictions. These professional accusers developed techniques for creating convincing testimony while maximizing their earning potential. The corruption of legal procedures in witch trials extended to the treatment of defense testimony and evidence. Witnesses who testified on behalf of accused witches could themselves face accusations of witchcraft or complicity. Evidence that contradicted prosecution narratives was dismissed as diabolic deception or insufficient to overcome the presumption of guilt that surrounded witchcraft accusations. The role of legal precedent in perpetuating corrupted procedures shows how initial innovations in witch prosecution became systematized over time. Successful prosecution techniques were documented, shared, and replicated across different jurisdictions, creating bodies of case law that legitimized increasingly extreme measures. What began as exceptional procedures became standard practice. The geographic variations in legal corruption reveal how different institutional structures affected the extent of witch persecution. Regions with strong appellate courts, independent legal traditions, or powerful institutions that could resist corruption experienced fewer witch trials. Areas with weak legal institutions or where prosecution served powerful interests saw more extensive persecution. The gradual reform of legal procedures that ended witch prosecutions came partly through the recognition that corrupted systems were undermining legal institutions themselves. Legal scholars and officials began to argue that the exceptional procedures used in witch trials were creating dangerous precedents that could be applied to other crimes, threatening the stability of legal systems. The involvement of medical experts in witch trials shows how corruption extended beyond legal personnel to include other professional groups. Physicians who examined accused witches for devil's marks or other supposed signs of demonic alliance often received payment for finding evidence that supported prosecution. Medical expertise was prostituted to serve predetermined legal outcomes. The psychological effects of corrupted legal procedures on communities were profound. When legal systems failed to provide protection or justice, social bonds dissolved and paranoia flourished. Communities learned that legal accusation could be a weapon for eliminating rivals or settling disputes, corrupting social relationships and creating climates of fear and suspicion. The legacy of legal corruption in witch trials extended far beyond the formal end of prosecutions. The precedents established for exceptional procedures, the acceptance of coerced evidence, and the subordination of legal protections to perceived security threats created templates that could be applied to other forms of persecution. The witch trial helped establish the legal framework for later forms of political and social persecution. Understanding the legal dimensions of witch persecution reveals how formal institutions of justice could be systematically corrupted to serve power rather than truth. The flames that consumed accused witches were lit not just by superstition, but by the calculated perversion of legal systems designed to protect the innocent. This corruption was not accidental, but represented the deliberate sacrifice of justice to serve political, economic, and social goals. The judicial machinery of witch persecution created a template for institutional persecution that could be adapted to different contexts and purposes. By examining how legal systems were corrupted during the witch trials, we can better understand how similar perversions of justice occur in other historical periods and contemporary contexts. The Holy Roman Empire experienced some of the most intense and systematic witch persecution in European history, with an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 executions between 1450 and 1750. The German experience reveals how political fragmentation, religious conflict, and economic disruption could combine to create optimal conditions for witch persecution. Understanding the German case illuminates the broader mechanisms that drove witch hunts across Europe while revealing the specific local factors that could intensify or moderate persecution. The fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire created intense competition between rival authorities that could be exploited through witch persecution. Unlike unified kingdoms like France or England, the empire consisted of hundreds of semi-autonomous territories, prince-bishoprics, free cities, duchies, and other political entities, each seeking to assert authority within their domains while demonstrating loyalty to higher powers. Witch hunts provided a mechanism for local rulers to showcase their piety, eliminate rivals, and consolidate control while claiming divine sanction for their actions. The prince-bishoprics were particularly active in witch persecution because these territories combined secular and religious authority in single rulers who needed to justify their dual roles. The Prince-Bishop of Wurzburg, Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn, 1573 to 1617, oversaw some of the most systematic witch hunts in German history, resulting in over 900 executions. Ector used witch trials to eliminate Protestant sympathizers, consolidate Catholic orthodoxy, and enrich his territories through property confiscation. His campaigns served simultaneously as religious purification, political consolidation, and economic redistribution. The Wurzburg persecutions reveal the institutional mechanisms that made German witch hunts so systematic and deadly. Ector established professional bureaucracies dedicated to identifying and prosecuting witches, complete with specialized courts, trained interrogators, and standardized procedures. These institutions operated with industrial efficiency, processing accused witches through assembly line systems that ensured high conviction rates and maximum property confiscation. The case of Bamberg under Prince Bishop Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim 1626161 demonstrates how witch persecution could become the defining feature of territorial administration. Dornheim's 5-year reign resulted in approximately 1,000 executions, roughly 1% of his territory as entire population. The Bamberg Witch House became a specialized facility for torture and confession, while the Prince Bishop's administration developed sophisticated record-keeping systems to track accusations, confessions, and property seizures. The Bamberg persecutions reveal how economic motives drove systematic witch hunting. Detailed records show that confiscated property from executed witches funded massive building projects, military campaigns, and administrative expansion. The witch hunts became a form of taxation through terror, extracting resources from the population while eliminating potential opposition. The Prince Bishop's Palace, built with proceeds from witch trials, stands as a monument to persecution as statecraft. The role of professional witch hunters in German territories illustrates the bureaucratization of persecution. Figures like the Jesuit Peter Binsfeld, who served as suffragan Bishop of Trier, developed theoretical frameworks that justified extensive witch hunting while training cadres of specialized prosecutors. These professionals shared techniques, coordinated campaigns across territorial boundaries, and created networks of expertise that standardized persecution methods. The Cologne witch trials of the 1620s demonstrate how urban environments could resist or moderate persecution through institutional checks and balances. The city's complex governance structure, involving multiple competing authorities and strong legal traditions, made systematic witch hunting more difficult. When prominent citizen Katharina Hennet was accused in 1627, her family's political connections and the city's legal procedures enabled effective resistance. Hennet was eventually executed, but only after years of legal maneuvering that revealed the political nature of the accusations. The geographic distribution of witch persecution within German territories reveals patterns related to political stability, economic conditions, and religious uniformity. Border regions, areas contested between Catholic and Protestant authorities, and territories experiencing economic hardship saw more intensive persecution. Conversely, regions with stable governance, strong legal traditions, or economic prosperity experienced fewer witch trials. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, intensified German witch persecution by creating conditions of chaos, displacement, and competition for resources. Military campaigns disrupted traditional social relationships while creating refugees and displaced populations that were vulnerable to accusation. The war also provided cover for settling political scores through witchcraft accusations. As normal legal protections broke down and extraordinary measures became routine. The case of Rothenburg ob der Tauber illustrates how some German territories could resist witch persecution despite pressure from neighboring regions. The city's legal traditions, strong merchant class, and stable governance structures enabled it to avoid the extensive witch hunts that devastated surrounding areas. Only a handful of witch trials occurred in Rothenburg, and most defendants were acquitted or received minimal sentences. The role of confession networks in German witch hunts reveals how persecution could become self-sustaining and geographically expansive. Accused witches under torture were forced to name accomplices and describe Sabbath gatherings, creating detailed maps of supposed conspiracy that could justify further arrests. These confession networks often crossed territorial boundaries, enabling coordination between different authorities and expanding persecution beyond local conflicts. The economic impact of German witch persecution extended far beyond immediate property confiscation. Entire regions lost significant portions of their populations, disrupting agricultural production, craft industries, and commercial networks. The destruction of human capital through witch persecution had long-term consequences for economic development, while the climate of fear and suspicion inhibited normal business relationships and community cooperation. The social dynamics of German witch persecution reveal how communities could be torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations. The case of the village of Obermarktel in Württemberg shows how an initial accusation could spiral into community-wide suspicion, with neighbors denouncing neighbors and families splitting along accusation lines. By the end of the persecution, trust within the community had been so thoroughly destroyed that normal social relationships required years to rebuild. The role of women in German witch persecution followed patterns seen elsewhere, but with some distinctive features. German territories targeted particularly high percentages of women, often over 90% in some regions, and developed elaborate theoretical justifications for gendered persecution. The influence of learned treatises on the supposed spiritual weakness of women was particularly strong in German scholarly circles. The resistance movements that emerged in some German territories reveal how persecution could generate organized opposition. The case of Adam Lonisser, a physician who criticized witch hunting in Frankfurt, shows how intellectual opposition could emerge even within systems that generally supported persecution. Lonisser has arguments about the medical rather than supernatural causes of supposed witchcraft symptoms, provided alternative explanations that challenged persecution narratives. The decline of witch persecution in German territories occurred gradually and unevenly, with some regions ending trials by the 1650s, while others continued into the early 18th century. The process was driven by multiple factors: exhaustion from the 30 Years' War, criticism from Enlightenment intellectuals, changing legal standards, and recognition that witch hunts were destabilizing rather than strengthening political authority. The legacy of German witch persecution shaped German political and legal culture in profound ways. The experience of systematic state persecution created lasting suspicion of centralized authority, while the memory of community breakdown during witch hunts influenced later approaches to social conflict and political dissent. The German experience also provided cautionary examples that influenced how other European regions approached witch persecution. The documentation of German witch trials is extraordinarily rich, providing detailed insights into the mechanics of persecution that are unavailable for other regions. Court records, administrative documents, and contemporary chronicles reveal the systematic nature of witch hunting while preserving individual stories of persecution and resistance. These sources demonstrate that German witch persecution was not chaotic hysteria, but calculated policy implemented through sophisticated institutional mechanisms. The international influence of German witch persecution extended through scholarly networks, institutional models, and personnel exchange. German-trained witch prosecutors served in other territories, spreading techniques and theoretical frameworks developed in the empire. The German model of systematic persecution influenced approach to witch hunting across Catholic Europe, while providing cautionary examples for Protestant regions. The German experience with witch persecution reveals how political fragmentation could intensify rather than moderate persecution by creating competition between rival authorities. Unlike unified kingdoms where central authority could impose restraint, the empire's structure enabled and encouraged competitive persecution as different rulers sought to demonstrate superior piety and effectiveness. Understanding the German case illuminates broader patterns of witch persecution while revealing the specific conditions that could transform accusations into genocide. The systematic nature of German witch hunting demonstrates the importance of institutional capacity in enabling large-scale persecution, while regional variations show how local factors could moderate or intensify the general pattern. The flames that consumed tens of thousands of accused witches in German territories were lit by political ambition, religious zeal, and economic opportunism operating within institutional frameworks designed to maximize efficiency and minimize restraint. The German experience provides perhaps the clearest example of witch persecution as statecraft, revealing how accusations of supernatural crime could serve very earthly purposes of power and control. England's experience with witch persecution differed significantly from continental patterns, revealing how national political structures, legal traditions, and religious developments could moderate the intensity of witch hunting while still enabling systematic persecution of vulnerable individuals. The English case illuminates the relationship between state power and witch persecution, while demonstrating how legal protections could both limit and enable different forms of prosecution. The legal foundation of English witch persecution was established through parliamentary statutes, rather than ecclesiastical or imperial decree, reflecting England's distinctive constitutional development. The Witchcraft Act of 1542, passed during Henry VIII's reign, made witchcraft a felony punishable by death, but this act was repealed in 1547. Elizabeth I's Witchcraft Act of 1563 re-established capital punishment for witchcraft, but required higher standards of evidence than continental law. This was replaced by James I's more severe Act of 1604, which expanded capital offenses and simplified prosecution procedures. The English approach to witch trials differed from continental practice in several crucial respects. English law prohibited torture except in cases of treason, meaning that confessions in witchcraft cases had to be obtained through psychological pressure rather than physical coercion. English courts also maintained some procedural protections for defendants, including the right to challenge evidence and call witnesses, though these protections were often inadequate in practice. The role of cunning folk in English witch persecution reveals the complex relationship between popular magic and official prosecution. England had a thriving culture of folk magic practitioners, cunning men and wise women who provided healing, divination, and protective services to their communities. These practitioners occupied an ambiguous position. Their services were widely used but potentially criminal under witchcraft statutes. Many witch prosecutions involved disputes between cunning folk and their clients, with failed magical services leading to accusations of maleficent witchcraft. The case of Elizabeth Southern's Old Demdike and the Pendle witch trials of 1612 illustrates the intersection of family rivalries, economic conflicts, and magical practice in English witch persecution. The accusations arose from competition between two families of cunning folk in Lancashire, with members of each family accusing the others of malevolent magic. The resulting trials led to 10 executions and revealed the economic dimensions of magical practice in early modern England. The English Civil War period 1642-1651 saw the most intense witch persecution in English history, with the campaigns of Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled Witchfinder General, resulting in over 100 executions. Hopkins operated in East Anglia during a period when normal legal restraints had broken down due to civil conflict. His methods included sleep deprivation, forced walking, and psychological torture to extract confessions, demonstrating how political chaos could enable more extreme persecution practices. Hopkins's career reveals the professional and economic dimensions of English witch hunting. He charged fees for his services, traveled between communities seeking cases, and developed standardized procedures for identifying and prosecuting witches. His pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, 1647, provided instruction for other would-be witch hunters while justifying his methods through religious and legal arguments. The role of gender in English witch persecution followed continental patterns, but with some distinctive features. Approximately 90% of English witch trial defendants were women, and accusations often centered on conflicts over neighborly obligations, charity, and community relationships. English witch accusations frequently involved disputes over food, money, or services, with women who refused charity or made unsuccessful requests becoming vulnerable to accusation. The case of Alice Samuel from the Warboys witch trials, 1589 to 1593, demonstrates how accusations could arise from conflicts between social classes. Samuel, an elderly woman of modest means, was accused by the wealthy Throckmorton family after refusing to provide services they demanded. The resulting trial became a cause célèbre, with detailed records revealing the social and economic tensions underlying the accusations. English witch trials often involved entire communities in ways that differed from continental practice. The absence of professional inquisitors meant that accusations typically arose from local disputes and were prosecuted by local magistrates with varying levels of expertise and commitment. This could result in more chaotic proceedings, but also enabled community resistance when local opinion opposed prosecution. The role of popular culture in English witch persecution was particularly significant. England had a vibrant tradition of pamphlet literature that documented and sensationalized witch trials, creating national audiences for local events. These publications spread knowledge of prosecution techniques while reinforcing stereotypes about witches and their supposed crimes. The commercialization of witch trial narratives helped sustain public interest in persecution while providing economic incentives for continued prosecution. The intellectual opposition to witch persecution that emerged in England during the 17th century influenced the decline of prosecutions. Figures like Reginald Scot, whose Discovery of Witchcraft, 1584, challenged the reality of witchcraft, and John Webster, whose Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft, 1677, criticized prosecution methods, provided alternative explanations for supposed witchcraft phenomena. These works influenced educated opinion and judicial practice, making convictions more difficult to obtain. The last major English witch trial, the case of Jane Wynnum in 1712, illustrates how changing attitudes and legal developments combined to end systematic persecution. Despite evidence of supposed witchcraft activities and community demands for prosecution, the judge actively undermined the prosecution case, while higher authorities commuted Wynnum's death sentence. The trial became a national controversy that revealed the extent to which educated opinion had turned against witch persecution. The regional variations in English witch persecution reflect different economic, social, and religious conditions. The southeastern counties of Essex, Kent, and Suffolk experienced the most intensive persecution, partly due to economic pressures from population growth and agricultural change. Puritan religious culture in these regions also created ideological support for aggressive prosecution of supposed spiritual threats. The role of economic change in English witch persecution becomes clear when examining the geographic and temporal distribution of trials. Regions experiencing enclosure of common lands, changes in agricultural practice, or a disruption of traditional charity relationships saw increased rates of witch accusations. The breakdown of traditional social relationships created conflicts that could escalate into witchcraft accusations. The English legal system's approach to evidence in witch trials reveals both protections and vulnerabilities for defendants. English law required more substantial evidence than many continental systems, but it accepted testimony from children, allowed leading questions, and often presumed guilt based on community reputation. The search for physical evidence of witchcraft, devil's marks, familiar animals, or cursed objects created new forms of persecution while maintaining appearance of legal rigor. The economic impact of English witch persecution was less severe than in Germany or other continental regions, partly because the scale was smaller and partly because property confiscation was less systematic. However, the social costs were still significant, as communities were disrupted by accusations and trials, while traditional social relationships were undermined by suspicion and fear. The role of local magistrates in English witch persecution varied significantly, with some actively promoting prosecution while others sought to minimize it. Sir Edward Coke, a prominent legal figure, strongly supported witch prosecution and helped develop legal precedents that facilitated conviction. In contrast, judges like Sir John Holt actively opposed witch persecution and used their authority to prevent convictions. The interaction between central and local authority in English witch persecution shows how national political structures could both enable and constrain prosecution. The English state was sufficiently centralized to impose legal standards and procedural requirements, but not so centralized as to prevent local variation in prosecution practices. This created a system where persecution could flourish in some regions while being suppressed in others. The religious dimensions of English witch persecution reflected the complex religious situation following the Reformation. Puritan communities were particularly prone to witch hunting, viewing witchcraft as evidence of demonic activity that threatened godly society. However, Anglican authorities were often more skeptical of witch accusations, seeing them as potentially disruptive to social order. The intellectual culture that emerged around English witch persecution included both supporters and critics of prosecution. Learned treatises defended the reality of witchcraft, while popular literature sensationalized trial proceedings. This intellectual engagement helped create national debates about witchcraft that eventually contributed to the decline of persecution. The English experience with witch persecution demonstrates how national institutions and legal traditions could moderate the intensity of persecution while still enabling systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals. The English case reveals the importance of legal protections and institutional constraints in limiting persecution, while showing how these same systems could be manipulated to serve oppressive purposes. The legacy of English witch persecution influenced colonial American practices while providing cautionary examples for later legal development. The English experience helped establish principles of evidence and procedure that would eventually contribute to broader protections for criminal defendants, while the memory of witch persecution served as a warning about the dangers of popular hysteria and judicial corruption. Understanding the English case illuminates the complex relationships between political structure, legal tradition, and persecution practices. The English experience shows how witch hunting could be moderated by institutional constraints, while revealing the persistent vulnerabilities that enabled persecution even within relatively protective legal frameworks. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 represent one of the most famous episodes of witch persecution in history, but their significance extends far beyond their immediate impact. Salem reveals how European patterns of witch persecution were transplanted to colonial environments, adapted to new social conditions, and ultimately challenged by emerging Enlightenment values. The American experience illuminates the relationship between colonial insecurity, religious anxiety, and the scapegoating mechanisms that drove witch accusations. The colonial context of Salem was crucial to understanding why witch accusations erupted with such intensity in a relatively small community. Salem Village, now Danvers, was experiencing multiple forms of stress that created optimal conditions for persecution. Economic conflicts between agricultural and commercial interests, political uncertainty following the loss of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter, ongoing threats from Native American warfare, and religious divisions between traditional Puritans and more moderate factions. The initial accusations arose in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, whose 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began experiencing fits and strange behaviors in early 1692. The local doctor, William Griggs, concluded that supernatural forces were responsible, setting in motion a chain of accusations that would ultimately result in over 200 arrests and 20 executions. The role of Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Paris household, reveals the racial dimensions of colonial witch persecution. Tituba's initial confession, likely coerced through threats of violence, provided detailed descriptions of witchcraft activities that shaped subsequent accusations and trials. Her status as an enslaved woman of color made her particularly vulnerable to accusation, while her exotic background, in Puritan eyes, lent credibility to claims about supernatural activities. The economic tensions underlying the Salem accusations become clear when examining the geographic and social distribution of accusers and accused. The initial accusations came primarily from Salem Village residents involved in agricultural pursuits. While many of the accused had connections to Salem town's commercial economy, this pattern reflected broader tensions between traditional Puritan agricultural society and emerging commercial capitalism. The case of Rebecca Nurse illustrates how witch accusations could target respected community members when economic and political interests were at stake. Nurse was a 71-year-old woman from a prominent family that had been involved in land disputes and political conflicts with other Salem families. Despite her reputation for piety and Christian virtue, she was accused, convicted, and executed, demonstrating how witch accusations could override normal social protections. The role of spectral evidence in Salem trials reveals the corruption of legal procedures that enabled persecution. Massachusetts courts accepted testimony from witnesses who claimed to see the apparitions or specters of accused witches committing harmful acts, even when the accused were physically present elsewhere. This spectral evidence became the primary basis for most convictions, creating an evidentiary standard that made defense nearly impossible. The young women who served as primary accusers in Salem, including Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis, occupied unusual positions of power and authority that would have been impossible in normal circumstances. Their accusations were taken seriously by adult authorities, and their dramatic performances during trials became central to prosecution cases. The trials temporarily inverted normal age and gender hierarchies while giving these young women unprecedented influence. The political dimensions of Salem become evident when examining the broader context of Massachusetts colonial politics. The trials occurred during a period of uncertainty about colonial governance, with the new royal charter creating tensions between royal authority and local autonomy. Governor William Phips, who had recently arrived from England, established a special court of Oyer and Terminer to handle the witch cases, demonstrating how political authorities used witch trials to assert control during periods of instability. The religious framework of Salem reflected distinctively Puritan approaches to witchcraft and community purification. Puritan theology emphasized the active presence of the devil in the world and the need for communities to identify and eliminate evil influences. The witch trials provided a mechanism for affirming community boundaries while demonstrating collective commitment to godly society. The role of Cotton Mather, the prominent Puritan minister and intellectual, reveals how learned religious authorities could promote and justify witch persecution. Mather's writings on witchcraft, including Memorable Providences, 1689, and Wonders of the Invisible World, 1693, provided theological and intellectual justification for aggressive prosecution while documenting supposed evidence of supernatural activities. However, the criticism that emerged from other religious authorities shows how witch persecution could also generate opposition. Increase Mather, Cotton's father and president of Harvard College, published Cases of Conscience, 1693, which challenged the use of spectral evidence and questioned the reliability of witch trial procedures. This religious opposition was crucial to ending the trials and preventing their resumption. The legal procedures used in Salem combine English common law traditions with special modifications for witchcraft cases. The court accepted types of evidence that would have been inadmissible in other cases, while applying presumptions of guilt that reversed normal legal protections. The use of touch tests, where accused witches were forced to touch afflicted persons to see if their fits would stop, created pseudoscientific procedures that appeared to provide objective evidence. The economic impact of the Salem trials extended beyond property confiscation to include the costs of imprisonment, trial procedures, and community disruption. Accused witches and their families bore the costs of their own imprisonment and trial, creating economic incentives for prolonged proceedings. The trials also disrupted normal economic activities as community attention focused on identifying and prosecuting witches. The gender patterns in Salem followed broader historical trends, but with some distinctive features. Approximately 78% of the accused were women, and many accusations reflected conflicts over female autonomy, property ownership, and social behavior. However, the trials also targeted some prominent men, including former Minister George Burroughs and wealthy merchant John Proctor, demonstrating how accusations could expand beyond typical gendered patterns. The community dynamics of Salem reveal how witch accusations could spread through social networks and family connections. The Putnam family was central to many accusations, using witch trials to settle scores with the Porter family and other rivals. These family conflicts became community-wide divisions that persisted long after the trials ended. The intervention of outside authorities eventually ended the Salem trials, demonstrating the importance of institutional checks on local persecution. Governor Phips dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692 and established new legal procedures that made convictions much more difficult. The superior court that replaced the special tribunal acquitted most remaining defendants and effectively ended the persecution. The aftermath of Salem created lasting impacts on American legal and cultural development. The recognition that innocent people had been executed led to official apologies, compensation for victims' families, and changes in legal procedures. The Salem experience became a cautionary tale about the dangers of popular hysteria and judicial corruption that influenced American approaches to civil liberties and legal protection. The intellectual response to Salem contributed to broader Enlightenment challenges to witchcraft belief. Colonial intellectuals like Thomas Brattle wrote detailed critiques of the trial procedures, while religious leaders like Increase Mather questioned the theological foundations of witch persecution. These colonial contributions to anti-witch persecution literature influenced broader intellectual developments. The legacy of Salem in American culture extends far beyond historical memory to include its use as a metaphor for political persecution and mass hysteria. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, 1953, used Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism, while the term witch hunt became common American political vocabulary. This cultural legacy demonstrates the continued relevance of the Salem experience for understanding persecution dynamics. The comparative context reveals how Salem differed from European witch persecution in important ways. The scale was smaller, the duration shorter, and the legal aftermath more thorough than most European cases. The colonial American context enabled both intensive persecution and effective resistance, creating a distinctive pattern that influenced later American approaches to civil liberties and legal protection. Salem demonstrates how witch persecution could emerge in new environments while revealing the social, economic, and political tensions that made such persecution possible. The American experience shows how European patterns of persecution could be adapted to colonial conditions, while also revealing how new institutional arrangements and intellectual developments could provide effective challenges to persecution. The Salem witch trials represent both the climax and the beginning of the end of systematic witch persecution in the English-speaking world. The intensity of the accusations and the thoroughness of the subsequent reaction created a template for understanding and preventing similar episodes of mass persecution. Salem thus serves as both a historical example of persecution dynamics and a foundational experience in developing American approaches to protecting individual rights against collective hysteria. The witch hunts of early modern Europe were fundamentally social phenomena that both reflected and created deep fractures within communities. Understanding why witches burned requires examining how accusations of witchcraft emerged from everyday social conflicts and then escalated into community-wide persecution that could destroy the very fabric of social relationships. The social dynamics of witch persecution reveal how fear, suspicion, and opportunism could transform neighbors into enemies and communities into killing fields. The initial spark for witch accusations typically arose from routine social conflicts, disputes over property boundaries, arguments about debt or charity, competition for resources, or personal grievances between neighbors. These conflicts were common in all communities, but during periods of social stress, they could escalate into accusations of supernatural harm. The transformation of ordinary disputes into witchcraft accusations reveals how communities under pressure could seek supernatural explanations for natural conflicts. The case of Agnes Samuel in Warboys, England, 1589 to 1593, illustrates this pattern. Samuel was accused after a dispute with the wealthy Throckmorton family over her refusal to provide certain services they demanded. What began as a conflict over social obligations escalated into accusations that Samuel had bewitched the Throckmorton children, ultimately resulting in her execution. The case demonstrates how class conflicts and social tensions could be reframed as supernatural threats requiring violent resolution. The role of women in making accusations against other women reveals the complex ways that gender oppression could turn women against each other. Women who accused neighbors of witchcraft were often seeking to protect themselves from suspicion while channeling community tensions toward vulnerable targets. This dynamic created a climate where female solidarity became dangerous and survival might depend on participating in the persecution of other women. The phenomenon of accusation chains shows how witch persecution could become self-perpetuating within communities. Once initial accusations were made, the accused under torture or psychological pressure would be forced to name accomplices, creating expanding networks of supposed conspiracy. These accusation chains could continue indefinitely, consuming entire communities if not stopped by outside intervention or resource exhaustion. The village of Wurzburg provides a stark example of how accusation chains could destroy communities. Between 1626 and 1631, the Prince Bishop's witch hunts resulted in over 900 executions in a territory with perhaps 30,000 inhabitants. Entire families were eliminated, social relationships were shattered, and normal community life became impossible. The persecution continued until it had consumed much of the social and economic infrastructure necessary for community survival. The role of children in witch accusations created particularly destructive social dynamics. Children could make accusations against adults with impunity, temporarily inverting normal authority relationships. The famous drummer of Tedworth case in England, 1661, began with claims that a local cunning man had cursed a family, leading to extensive supernatural phenomena allegedly centered on the family's children. These cases showed how accusations involving children could mobilize community sympathy while making rational discussion difficult. The economic dimensions of community breakdown through which persecution extended beyond property confiscation to include the destruction of trust and cooperation necessary for economic life. Communities experiencing witch hunts saw disruption of labor relationships, breakdown of credit and debt arrangements, and cessation of normal commercial activities. The social capital necessary for economic cooperation was destroyed by suspicion and fear. The religious aspects of community breakdown involve the disruption of normal spiritual and moral relationships. Witch hunts divided communities along religious lines while corrupting traditional institutions of spiritual guidance and moral instruction. Clergy who promoted witch persecution found their moral authority challenged by the violence they endorsed, while communities struggled to reconcile Christian teachings about forgiveness with demands for elimination of supposed evil. The legal framework of witch persecution created institutional mechanisms that accelerated community breakdown. The acceptance of spectral evidence, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the suspension of normal legal protections created systems where accusation became tantamount to conviction. These corrupted legal procedures made rational resolution of conflicts impossible, while providing institutional sanction for community violence. The psychological impact of witch persecution on communities created lasting trauma that extended far beyond immediate victims. Survivors of witch hunts lived in communities where trust had been shattered, where neighbors had betrayed neighbors, and where violence had been sanctioned by legitimate authority. The psychological scars of persecution could persist for generations, influencing community relationships long after formal trials ended. The phenomena of witch persecution contagion shows how accusations could spread between communities through communication networks and shared cultural patterns. News of successful witch prosecutions in one area could inspire similar accusations in neighboring communities, creating regional epidemics of persecution. This contagion effect was facilitated by the circulation of pamphlets, the mobility of officials, and the standardization of persecution techniques. The role of social isolation in making individuals vulnerable to witch accusations reveals how community Membership could provide protection while exclusion created vulnerability. Newcomers, social outsiders, and individuals who had violated community norms were particularly susceptible to accusation. The witch hunt thus reinforced social boundaries while eliminating those who didn't fit neatly into established categories. The intergenerational aspects of witch persecution show how accusations could be passed down through families and communities. Children who witness witch trials often grow up with traumatic memories and distorted understanding of social relationships. Some became accusers themselves, perpetuating cycles of persecution across generations. Others became skeptics who questioned the legitimacy of supernatural explanations for social problems. The seasonal patterns of witch accusations reflect the relationship between social stress and persecution. Many accusations arose during winter months when communities were isolated and resources scarce, or during planting and harvest seasons when agricultural success or failure could determine community survival. These patterns show how natural cycles of stress and anxiety could be channeled into supernatural explanations and violent resolutions. The class dynamics of witch persecution reveal how social hierarchies could be both reinforced and temporarily disrupted by accusations. While most victims came from lower social classes, accusations could also target wealthy individuals whose property was coveted or whose influence was resented. The democratic nature of supernatural accusations, anyone could be accused regardless of social position, created anxiety among elites while providing opportunities for social mobility through participation in prosecution. The gender dynamics of community breakdown through witch persecution show how accusations could disrupt normal gender relationships while ultimately reinforcing patriarchal control. Women gained temporary power as accusers while losing any claim to protection as potential victims. The witch hunt created a climate where female autonomy became inherently suspect, while male authority was reinforced through control of legal and religious institutions. The role of community leaders in either promoting or resisting witch persecution was crucial to determining outcomes. Communities with strong skeptical leadership could often resist or moderate persecution, while those with weak or credulous leadership became vulnerable to extensive witch hunts. The quality of local leadership thus became a matter of life and death for vulnerable community members. The long-term consequences of community breakdown through witch persecution included demographic disruption, economic decline, and cultural trauma that could persist for centuries. Communities that experienced intensive witch hunts often never fully recovered their previous population levels or economic vitality. The memory of persecution became part of local identity, influencing attitudes toward authority, community cooperation, and social conflict resolution. The healing process that occurred after witch persecution ended reveals the resilience of human communities, while showing the difficulty of recovering from systematic violence. Some communities developed new institutions and practices designed to prevent similar episodes, while others simply tried to forget their experiences. The varying success of these recovery efforts shows the importance of addressing trauma and rebuilding trust after episodes of community violence. The social dynamics of witch persecution provide crucial insights into how ordinary communities could become sites of systematic violence while revealing the human costs of persecution that extended far beyond individual victims. Understanding these dynamics is essential for recognizing similar patterns in other historical contexts and contemporary situations where communities face stress and seek scapegoats for their difficulties. The breakdown of communities through witch persecution demonstrates the fragility of social relationships and the importance of institutions that protect vulnerable individuals from collective violence. The witch hunts serve as a warning about how quickly ordinary social conflicts can escalate into deadly persecution when legal protections fail and moral restraints collapse. The systematic use of torture in witch trials represents one of the most disturbing aspects of early modern persecution, revealing how legal systems could be corrupted to produce predetermined outcomes rather than discover truth. Torture was not an incidental feature of witch persecution, but a central mechanism that created evidence, expanded accusations, and justified continued prosecution. Understanding the role of torture illuminates the institutional mechanisms that made witch hunts possible, while revealing the human cost of corrupted justice. The legal justification for torture in witchcraft cases was based on the argument that this crime was exceptionally difficult to prove through ordinary evidence, and that accused witches were unlikely to confess voluntarily due to their diabolic allegiance. This reasoning, codified in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, provided theoretical justification for suspending normal legal protections and employing extreme methods to extract confessions. The exceptional nature of witchcraft thus justified exceptional procedures that would have been illegal in other criminal cases. The techniques of torture employed in witch trials were sophisticated and designed to break down physical and psychological resistance while extracting detailed confessions that supported prosecution narratives. The strappado involved suspending victims from their bound wrists, often with weights attached to their feet, causing excruciating pain and potential permanent injury. Thumb screws and leg screws applied increasing pressure to digits and limbs, while the rack stretched victims' bodies beyond natural limits. But physical torture was often combined with psychological torment that could be equally devastating. Sleep deprivation, forced walking for hours or days, exposure to extreme temperatures, and constant interrogation were used to break down mental resistance. The psychological effects of these methods could persist long after physical healing, creating lasting trauma that affected victims' ability to function normally if they survived. The case of Johannes Junius, mayor of Bamberg, reveals the systematic nature of torture in witch trials. Junius was arrested in 1628 and subjected to extensive torture that forced him to confess to attending sabbats, consorting with demons, and practicing malevolent magic. His secret letter smuggled from prison describes the torture process in graphic detail while maintaining his innocence. Junius was executed despite his social prominence and initial skepticism from authorities, demonstrating how torture could overcome any form of resistance. The production of confessions through torture followed standardized patterns that reflected the expectations and beliefs of interrogators rather than the experiences of victims. Accused witches were forced to admit to specific activities, signing pacts with the devil, attending sabbats, practicing harmful magic that conformed to established theological and legal frameworks. These formulaic confessions then became evidence supporting the theoretical structure of witchcraft belief. The sexual dimensions of torture and confession reveal the gendered nature of witch persecution and the ways that violence against women could be justified through legal and religious language. Female victims were subjected to intimate searches for devil's marks, forced to confess to sexual encounters with demons, and made to describe orgiastic Sabbath gatherings in explicit detail. This sexualized violence served multiple purposes. It humiliated victims, titillated audiences, and reinforced stereotypes about female sexuality. The expansion of accusations through tortured confessions created networks of supposed conspiracy that justified ever wider persecution. Under torture, accused witches were forced to name accomplices, describe Sabbath gatherings, and identify other community members as participants in supernatural activities. These forced testimonies then became evidence in subsequent trials, creating self-reinforcing cycles of accusation and prosecution. The case of the Pendle witches in England, 1612, shows how confession chains could develop even without systematic torture. Initial accusations against members of two competing cunning families led to arrests and Interrogations that produced detailed confessions about Sabbath activities and harmful magic. These confessions, likely produced through psychological pressure rather than physical torture, implicated additional individuals and created a network of supposed conspiracy that justified multiple executions. The role of professional torturers and interrogators reveals the bureaucratization of violence within legal systems. Trained specialists developed expertise in extracting confessions while maintaining victims' survival long enough to provide testimony. These professionals shared techniques, refined methods, and created standardized procedures that maximized effectiveness while preserving the appearance of legal legitimacy. The economic aspects of torture in witch trials created perverse incentives for prolonged and extensive use. In many jurisdictions, the costs of torture and interrogation were charged to victims or their families, creating financial incentives for extended proceedings. Torturers and interrogators received fees for their services, while court officials benefited from the additional proceedings that torture-induced confessions generated. The documentation of torture proceedings provides disturbing insights into the mindset of officials who supervise these processes. Court records often describe torture techniques in clinical detail while recording victims' responses as evidence of their guilt or innocence. This bureaucratization of violence shows how systematic cruelty could be integrated into normal legal procedures. The medical aspects of torture reveal how professional knowledge could be corrupted to serve persecution. Physicians were sometimes involved in determining victims' capacity to withstand torture, treating injuries to enable continued interrogation, and interpreting physical evidence of supposed supernatural activities. This medical complicity shows how professional ethics could be subordinated to legal and political objectives. The resistance strategies employed by torture victims reveal the human capacity to maintain dignity and truth, even under extreme duress. Some victims maintained their innocence despite prolonged torture, while others found ways to minimize harm to themselves and others through careful responses to interrogation. The survival strategies developed by torture victims demonstrate remarkable resilience in the face of institutional violence. The psychological impact of torture extended beyond immediate victims to include interrogators, court officials, and community members who witnessed or learned about these proceedings. The normalization of systematic violence corrupted entire legal and social systems while traumatizing communities that participated in or tolerated such practices. The theological justifications for torture reveal how religious doctrine could be manipulated to support institutional violence. The argument that diabolic allegiance made normal legal procedures inadequate provided religious sanction for extreme methods, while positioning torture as necessary for spiritual salvation. This theological framework made torture appear not just legal, but morally required. The international transmission of torture techniques shows how methods developed for witch persecution could spread across jurisdictions and influence other forms of criminal prosecution. Specialist knowledge about interrogation techniques, torture equipment, and confession procedures circulated through professional networks and scholarly publications, standardizing practices across different legal systems. The decline of torture in witch trials came partly through recognition that coerced confessions were unreliable and that torture was corrupting legal institutions themselves. Enlightenment critics argued that torture produced testimony that reflected interrogators' expectations rather than defendants' actual experiences, making it counterproductive for discovering truth. Legal reforms gradually restricted the use of torture while raising evidentiary standards for criminal convictions. The lasting effects of torture on legal systems included both negative precedents that justified exceptional procedures in other contexts and positive reforms that strengthened protections against coerced evidence. The memory of torture in witch trials influenced later developments in criminal law, international human rights standards, and ethical guidelines for law enforcement. The documentation of torture and witch trials provides some of the most detailed historical evidence about the systematic use of violence within legal systems. These records reveal not only the mechanics of torture, but also the institutional structures that enabled and justified such practices. This historical evidence has contemporary relevance for understanding how legal systems can be corrupted and how institutional violence can be normalized. The role of torture in witch trials illuminates broader questions about the relationship between truth and power, the corruption of legal institutions, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. The systematic use of torture reveals how the pursuit of predetermined outcomes could override commitment to justice, while showing how institutional violence could be justified through legal and religious language. Understanding torture in witch trials is essential for comprehending how persecution could be sustained over time and across different jurisdictions. The production of evidence through torture created the appearance of vast, supernatural conspiracies while providing justification for continued prosecution. Without torture, most witch hunts would have collapsed due to lack of evidence, making this institutional violence central to the entire phenomenon of witch persecution. The legacy of torture in witch trials serves as a warning about the dangers of exceptional legal procedures and the importance of maintaining legal protections even when facing perceived extraordinary threats. The corruption of legal systems through torture in witch trials provides historical precedent for understanding how similar corruptions occur in other contexts, where fear and security concerns override commitment to justice and human rights. Despite the intensity and widespread nature of witch persecution, resistance and skepticism existed throughout the period of the Great Witch Hunts. Understanding why witches burned requires examining not only the forces that drove persecution, but also the individuals and institutions that challenged, moderated, or opposed witch hunting. The history of resistance reveals alternative possibilities and helps explain why persecution eventually declined, while providing models for opposition to similar injustices. The earliest forms of resistance to witch persecution came from within legal and religious institutions whose procedures and principles were being corrupted by prosecution demands. Some judges, clergy, and scholars recognized that witch trials violated established legal norms and religious teachings, creating internal opposition that could moderate or prevent persecution. This institutional resistance was often more effective than popular opposition because it operated within the systems that enabled persecution. The case of Cornelius Loos, a professor at the University of Mainz, illustrates early scholarly resistance to witch persecution. In the 1590s, Loos wrote detailed critiques of witch trial procedures, arguing that confessions obtained through torture were unreliable and that supposed supernatural phenomena had natural explanations. His opposition was so effective that he was eventually forced to recant his views publicly, but his writings continued to influence skeptical opinion throughout Europe. The role of physicians in challenging witchcraft accusations reveals how professional knowledge could be used to resist persecution. Medical practitioners who examined accused witches sometimes found natural explanations for supposed supernatural phenomena, challenging the basis for prosecution. Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician whose De Prestigiis Demonem, 1563, provided detailed critiques of witch persecution, argued that accused witches were actually suffering from mental illness rather than demonic influence. Legal professionals also played crucial roles in resistance to witch persecution. Some judges used their authority to prevent convictions by applying strict evidentiary standards, questioning witness testimony, or finding procedural grounds for dismissal. The Parliament of Paris, France's highest court, consistently rejected most witch cases that came before it, creating a zone of relative safety for accused witches in areas under its jurisdiction. The intellectual opposition to witch persecution that emerged during the 17th century provided theoretical frameworks for challenging the entire enterprise of witch hunting. Critics like Reginald Scott in England, Friedrich Spee in Germany, and Balthasar Becker in the Netherlands published detailed analyses that questioned the reality of witchcraft, the reliability of trial procedures, and the morality of persecution. These works influenced educated opinion and provided authorities with intellectual justification for ending prosecutions. The case of Friedrich Spee reveals both the possibilities and dangers of resistance to witch persecution. As a Jesuit priest, Spee served as confessor to condemned witches and became convinced of their innocence through direct observation of trial procedures. His Caudio Criminalis 1631 provided a devastating critique of witch persecution that was published. Anonymously due to the dangers of open opposition, Spee's work influenced Catholic authorities while demonstrating how personal experience with persecution could create powerful opponents. Popular resistance to witch persecution took various forms, from subtle non-cooperation to active protection of accused individuals. Communities sometimes refused to provide witnesses against accused witches, hid potential victims, or raised money for legal defense. This popular resistance was often more effective when it was organized by respected community leaders who could provide legitimacy and protection for opposition activities. The role of family networks in resisting witch persecution shows how kinship ties could provide protection against accusations while enabling organized resistance efforts. Families with sufficient resources could hire lawyers, influence authorities, or relocate threatened members to safer jurisdictions. The case of Johannes Kepler, as successful defense of his mother against witchcraft accusations, demonstrates how family influence and legal expertise could overcome prosecution attempts. Religious authorities who opposed witch persecution faced particular difficulties because they had to challenge practices that were officially sanctioned by church doctrine while maintaining their own religious credibility. Some clergy found ways to undermine persecution through pastoral care, legal intervention, or theological arguments that questioned specific practices without challenging the reality of witchcraft itself. The geographic variations in resistance to witch persecution reveal how local conditions could enable or constrain opposition activities. Regions with strong legal traditions, powerful institutions, or political stability were more likely to resist persecution effectively. The Venetian Republic, for example, experienced relatively few witch trials, partly because its sophisticated legal system and stable political structure provided protection against persecution pressures. The role of international networks in resistance to witch persecution shows how opposition could transcend local boundaries, while drawing on broader intellectual and religious movements. Correspondence between scholars, circulation of critical text, and exchange of personnel between institutions created communities of opposition that could survive local persecution while influencing broader opinion. The economic dimensions of resistance to witch persecution included efforts to protect property rights, maintain commercial relationships, and preserve community economic networks that were threatened by prosecution. Merchants, craftsmen, and other economic actors sometimes organized to resist persecution when it threatened their interests or disrupted normal business activities. The gender dynamics of resistance reveal how women could find ways to protect themselves and others despite their vulnerable position within patriarchal systems. Some women used their positions as healers, teachers, or community leaders to provide protection or assistance to those threatened with accusation. Female networks of mutual protection could sometimes provide effective resistance to persecution pressures. The legal strategies developed by defenders of accused witches created precedents that gradually strengthened protections for criminal defendants. Lawyers who represented witch trial defendants developed arguments about evidence, procedure, and defendant rights that influenced broader legal development while providing immediate protection for their clients. The role of higher authorities in ending persecution shows how institutional hierarchy could provide checks on local persecution when upper-level officials chose to intervene. Royal courts, church hierarchies, and imperial institutions sometimes imposed restraint on local authorities when persecution became too extensive or politically dangerous. The case of Louis XIV's intervention in French witch trials demonstrates how central authority could end persecution through direct command. In 1682, the French king issued an edict that severely restricted prosecution of witchcraft while requiring higher standards of evidence for conviction. This royal intervention effectively ended systematic witch persecution in France while providing a model for other monarchs. The intellectual transformation that made resistance to witch persecution more acceptable occurred gradually through the influence of Enlightenment thinking, scientific development, and religious change. New approaches to understanding natural phenomena reduced reliance on supernatural explanations while emerging political. Theories questioned the authority of traditional institutions to impose extraordinary justice. The social movements that opposed witch persecution sometimes drew on broader currents of religious reform, political opposition, or social change that provided legitimacy and protection for resistance activities. The connection between opposition to witch persecution and other reform movements shows how resistance could be strengthened through alliance with broader social forces. The documentation of resistance activities provides insights into the strategies and motivations of those who opposed persecution, while revealing the dangers they faced. Letters, court records, and published works preserve evidence of resistance networks while showing how opposition developed over time and across different jurisdictions. The legacy of resistance to witch persecution influenced broader developments in legal protection, human rights, and institutional accountability. The arguments developed by opponents of witch hunting provided precedents for later efforts to protect vulnerable individuals from persecution, while establishing principles that continue to influence contemporary approaches to justice and civil liberties. The ultimate success of resistance to witch persecution demonstrates that even systematic and widespread persecution could be challenged and overcome through sustained opposition. The decline and eventual end of witch trials resulted from the cumulative effect of resistance activities that gradually shifted opinion, influenced authorities, and created alternative approaches to social problems. Understanding resistance to witch persecution provides crucial insights into how opposition to injustice can develop and succeed, even under adverse conditions. The history of resistance reveals both the possibilities and limitations of challenging institutional persecution while providing models for contemporary efforts to protect human rights and promote justice. The courage displayed by individuals who risk their own safety to oppose witch persecution serves as inspiration for continued resistance to injustice while demonstrating the importance of maintaining alternative voices even in periods of widespread persecution. Their example shows that resistance is possible even under the most difficult circumstances, and that such resistance can ultimately contribute to positive social change. The gradual end of systematic witch persecution across Europe and colonial America was not the result of a single cause, but emerged from the convergence of multiple intellectual, legal, political, and social developments that undermine the foundations of witch hunting. Understanding why witch hunts declined reveals as much about the nature of persecution as the forces that originally drove it, while illuminating the complex process by which societies abandon systematic violence and embrace alternative approaches to social problems. The intellectual transformation that contributed to the decline of witch persecution began with the scientific revolution and accelerated through the Enlightenment. New approaches to understanding natural phenomena reduced reliance on supernatural explanations for events that had previously been attributed to witchcraft. The work of scientists like Galileo, Newton, and Harvey provided mechanical and rational explanations for natural processes, making supernatural intervention seem less necessary or plausible. The development of more sophisticated medical knowledge was particularly important in challenging witchcraft accusations. Physicians increasingly recognized that symptoms previously attributed to supernatural causes, seizures, hallucinations, unusual behaviors, had natural medical explanations. The emerging understanding of mental illness provided alternative frameworks for interpreting behaviors that had previously been seen as evidence of demonic possession or supernatural influence. Legal reforms gradually raised evidentiary standards and procedural protections that made witch convictions more difficult to obtain. The rejection of spectral evidence, restrictions on the use of torture, and requirements for corroborating testimony created legal obstacles to prosecution that judges and prosecutors found increasingly difficult to overcome. These reforms reflected broader changes in legal philosophy that emphasized due process and individual rights over collective security concerns. The case of the decline of witch prosecutions in France illustrates how central authority could end. Persecution through legal and administrative action. Louis XIV's edict of 1682 required that all witchcraft cases be appealed to the Parliament of Paris, which consistently rejected most prosecutions. This centralization of authority over witch cases effectively ended provincial persecution while demonstrating royal commitment to legal reform. The religious changes that contributed to declining witch persecution included both theological developments and institutional reforms within Christian churches. Some religious authorities began to question whether diabolic magic was as prevalent or powerful as previously believed, while others emphasized that focusing on witchcraft distracted from more important spiritual concerns. The growth of religious skepticism and deism also reduced belief in supernatural intervention in human affairs. The economic factors that had originally driven witch persecution began to change as European societies developed more stable economic institutions and social welfare systems. The emergence of more sophisticated financial systems, insurance mechanisms, and government support reduced communities' vulnerability to economic crisis, while providing alternative explanations and solutions for economic problems. The political stabilization that occurred across much of Europe in the late 17th and early 18th centuries reduced the political incentives for witch persecution. As nation-states consolidated authority and developed more effective institutions for managing social conflict, rulers no longer needed witch hunts as mechanisms for demonstrating power or controlling populations. Political stability also enabled legal institutions to function more independently and resist pressure for exceptional procedures. The social changes that accompanied modernization altered the community dynamics that had supported witch persecution. Urbanization, improved transportation, and expanded education created more diverse and mobile societies where the tight-knit communities that bred witch accusations became less common. Social mobility and geographic movement made it more difficult to maintain the detailed knowledge of neighbors' activities that facilitated accusation. The role of professional skeptics in undermining witch persecution cannot be overstated. Intellectuals, physicians, lawyers, and clergy who publicly challenged witchcraft beliefs provided alternative authorities that communities could consult when facing supposed supernatural problems. The circulation of skeptical literature created informed opposition that could challenge persecution advocates in public debate. The case of Balthasar Bekker, a Dutch Reformed minister whose De Better Verdi Wereld, The World Bewitched, 1691 to 1693, provided comprehensive critique of witchcraft beliefs, illustrates the impact of religious skepticism. Becker's work, which argued that the devil had no power to influence physical events, was widely read across Europe and influenced both popular and elite opinion about supernatural phenomena. The institutional memory of witch persecution also contributed to its decline as communities and authorities recognized the destructive consequences of systematic accusation and prosecution. Regions that had experienced intensive witch hunts often developed cultural memories of the devastation caused by persecution, creating resistance to renewed accusations when they appeared. The international dimension of declining witch persecution shows how intellectual and legal developments could cross national boundaries while creating common standards for criminal justice. The circulation of legal scholars, exchange of ideas between universities, and diplomatic communication between courts created transnational networks that promoted legal reform and criminal justice improvement. The demographic consequences of witch persecution may have contributed to its decline by eliminating many of the individuals who had served as traditional accusers or who possessed the local knowledge necessary for making credible accusations. In regions that experienced extensive persecution, the social networks that sustained witch hunting were disrupted or destroyed. The emergence of alternative explanations for social problems reduced the perceived need for witch persecution as a mechanism for managing community stress. The development of more sophisticated understanding of disease, weather, economics, and social psychology provided natural explanations for problems that had previously required supernatural interpretation. The role of individual cases in accelerating the decline of witch persecution shows how particular trials could create turning points in public opinion. Cases where obviously innocent individuals were convicted, where trial procedures were particularly corrupt, or where popular opposition developed could generate broader skepticism about witch persecution and pressure for legal reform. The Salem witch trials served this function in colonial America, where the extent and intensity of the accusations eventually generated effective opposition. The intervention of authorities like Increase Mather and Thomas Brattle, combined with the recognition that many innocent people had been executed, created lasting resistance to renewed witch persecution in American colonies. The economic costs of witch persecution eventually became a factor in its decline, as authorities recognized that the resources devoted to trials and imprisonment could be used more productively for other purposes. The disruption of normal economic activities caused by extensive prosecution also created pressure for alternative approaches to managing social problems. The changing role of women in society may have contributed to declining witch persecution by reducing the gender tensions that had fueled many accusations. As women's legal status improved and alternative roles became available, the conflicts over female autonomy that had generated many witchcraft accusations became less intense. The influence of successful resistance to witch persecution in some regions provided models that could be applied elsewhere. Areas that had successfully ended persecution through legal reform, institutional change, or intellectual development offered examples that other regions could follow. The gradual nature of decline in witch persecution reveals how deep-seated cultural beliefs and institutional practices change slowly rather than suddenly. Even after official prosecution ended, popular beliefs about witchcraft often persisted, creating potential for renewed persecution under different circumstances. The international coordination of efforts to end witch persecution shows how reform movements could develop transnational character while drawing on shared intellectual and religious traditions. The correspondence between scholars, circulation of legal precedents, and coordination between reform-minded authorities created networks that accelerated the process of change. The legacy of the decline of witch persecution influenced broader developments in criminal justice, human rights, and approaches to social problems. The legal reforms developed to end witch persecution provided precedents for protecting other vulnerable groups, while the intellectual frameworks used to challenge supernatural explanations influenced scientific and social development. Understanding how witch persecution declined provides insights into how other forms of systematic persecution can be challenged and ended. The combination of intellectual challenge, legal reform, institutional change, and cultural transformation that ended witch hunting offers models for contemporary efforts to promote human rights and protect vulnerable populations. The decline of witch persecution demonstrates that even deeply entrenched, systems of persecution can be overcome through sustained effort and institutional change. The success of reform efforts provides hope for addressing contemporary forms of persecution while showing the importance of maintaining alternative voices and institutional protections for vulnerable individuals. The gradual transformation that ended witch persecution reveals the complex process by which societies abandon systematic violence and embrace more rational and humane approaches to social problems. This historical example provides both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to promote justice and protect human dignity. The witch hunts of early modern Europe and colonial America left profound legacies that continue to influence contemporary society in ways both obvious and subtle. More than 3 centuries after the last witch was burned at the stake, the patterns of persecution, scapegoating, and social control revealed by the witch trials remain relevant for understanding modern forms of discrimination, political persecution, and mass hysteria. Examining these legacies revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and social dynamics while providing insights into how similar patterns can be recognized and resisted. The most direct legacy of witch persecution lies in the development of modern legal protections and civil liberties. The recognition that witch trials had resulted in the execution of innocent people through corrupted legal procedures contributed to reforms that strengthened criminal justice systems. Prohibitions against torture, requirements for corroborating evidence, protections for defendants' rights, and restrictions on exceptional legal procedures all trace their development partly to reactions against the injustices of witch persecution. The Salem witch trials were particularly influential in American legal development. The aftermath of Salem contributed to strengthening procedural protections in colonial courts, while providing a foundational example of how popular hysteria could corrupt justice. The memory of Salem influenced American approaches to civil liberties and helped establish principles of legal protection that became embedded in constitutional law. The intellectual legacy of opposition to witch persecution contributed to broader Enlightenment developments that emphasized reason over superstition, evidence over authority, and individual rights over collective fears. The arguments developed by critics of witch hunting provided templates for challenging other forms of institutional persecution, while establishing intellectual frameworks that continue to influence approaches to civil liberties and human rights. The cultural memory of witch persecution has provided a powerful metaphor for political persecution and mass hysteria that remains central to contemporary political discourse. The term witch hunt has become common vocabulary for describing unfair persecution, while references to Salem regularly appear in discussions of political trials, moral panics, and social scapegoating. This metaphorical use demonstrates the continued relevance of witch persecution for understanding contemporary social dynamics. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, 1953, which used the Salem witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism and political persecution during the Cold War, illustrates how historical examples of persecution can illuminate contemporary injustices. Miller's work helped establish Salem as a symbol of the dangers of ideological extremism, while providing a framework for understanding how fear can be manipulated for political purposes. The gendered dimensions of witch persecution continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about violence against women, and the ways that female autonomy can be suppressed through accusations of deviance or dangerousness. The patterns of witch persecution, targeting women who challenge social norms, used their knowledge independently, or lived outside male protection remain relevant for understanding modern forms of gender-based persecution and discrimination. The economic aspects of witch persecution provide insights into how economic insecurity and inequality can drive scapegoating and violence against vulnerable populations. The connection between witch hunts and periods of economic hardship offers lessons about how societies under economic stress may seek easy explanations for complex problems while targeting those who are least able to defend themselves. The religious dimensions of witch persecution remain relevant for understanding how religious extremism can justify violence while providing insights into the relationship between spiritual authority and political power. The ways that religious institutions used witch persecution to consolidate authority and suppress dissent offer parallels to contemporary situations where religious doctrine is used to justify persecution or discrimination. The social dynamics of witch persecution, the breakdown of community trust, the turning of neighbors against neighbors, the creation of climates of fear and suspicion provide frameworks for understanding how societies can be torn apart by accusation and counter-accusation. These patterns remain relevant for understanding ethnic conflicts, political polarization, and social fragmentation in contemporary contexts. The role of intellectuals and institutions in both promoting and resisting witch persecution offers lessons about the responsibilities of educated elites and professional institutions when facing societal pressure to participate in or enable persecution. The examples of both complicity and resistance during the witch hunts provide models for contemporary professionals facing similar ethical challenges. The international dimensions of witch persecution reveal how ideas about persecution and social control can spread across boundaries while showing how international cooperation can contribute to ending systematic violations of human rights. The transnational networks that both promoted and opposed witch hunting offer precedents for understanding how contemporary human rights movements develop and succeed. The psychological aspects of witch persecution provide insights into individual and collective behavior during periods of crisis and uncertainty. The mechanisms of accusation, confession, and community participation in persecution revealed during witch trials offer frameworks for understanding how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic violence, while showing the psychological costs of both perpetration and victimization. The documentation and historical study of witch persecution has itself become part of its legacy, providing methodologies for investigating and understanding systematic persecution, while preserving memory of injustice that might otherwise be forgotten or minimized. The detailed records of witch trials offer unprecedented insights into the mechanics of persecution that continue to inform historical and social scientific research. The memorial and educational efforts that have developed around sites of witch persecution demonstrate how societies can use historical memory to promote education about injustice while honoring victims of persecution. Museums, monuments, and educational programs related to witch trials serve contemporary functions in promoting tolerance and critical thinking about persecution. The legal precedents established during witch trials, both positive and negative, continue to influence contemporary legal systems. The exceptional procedures developed for prosecuting witches provided templates that have been used in other contexts involving perceived security threats, while the reforms developed to end witch persecution established principles that continue to protect individual rights. The feminist scholarship that has emerged around witch persecution has contributed to broader understanding of gender-based violence and oppression, while providing frameworks for analyzing how patriarchal systems use accusations of deviance to control women's behavior. This scholarship has influenced contemporary approaches to understanding violence against women and gender discrimination. The popular culture representations of witch persecution, from Hollywood movies to television shows to historical fiction, shape contemporary understanding of these historical events while demonstrating their continued cultural relevance. These representations sometimes distort historical reality, but also keep memory of persecution alive while making it accessible to broader audiences. The therapeutic and healing practices that have developed around witch persecution memory demonstrate how historical trauma can be addressed through community healing and reconciliation processes. Efforts to memorialize victims, acknowledge injustice, and promote healing offer models for addressing other forms of historical trauma. The academic study of witch persecution has contributed to broader understanding of persecution dynamics, social psychology, and historical methodology, while providing training grounds for scholars who study other forms of systematic violence. The interdisciplinary nature of witch persecution studies has influenced approaches to studying genocide, political persecution, and human rights violations. The contemporary pagan and neo-pagan movements that claim connection to historical witchcraft victims demonstrate how historical persecution can be reinterpreted and reclaimed by marginalized communities seeking to establish identity and resist discrimination. While these movements may not accurately represent historical witchcraft, they illustrate how memory of persecution can be used for empowerment and community building. The tourism industry that has developed around witch persecution sites demonstrates how historical memory can be commercialized while raising questions about appropriate ways to memorialize tragedy. The balance between education and entertainment at sites like Salem raises broader questions about how societies should preserve and present difficult histories. The technological capabilities that enable contemporary surveillance and social control echo some of the mechanisms that made witch persecution possible, while creating new possibilities for both persecution and resistance. Understanding how historical persecution operated provides insights into how modern technologies might be used for oppressive purposes, while suggesting strategies for protection and resistance. The global human rights frameworks that have developed since World War II draw partly on lessons learned from historical persecution, including witch trials, while providing institutional mechanisms for preventing and responding to systematic persecution. The international human rights system represents an attempt to create the kind of institutional protections that were lacking during the witch persecution period. The environmental and climate change discussions that reference witch persecution as an example of scapegoating during periods of environmental stress offer insights into how societies might avoid similar patterns when facing contemporary environmental challenges. Understanding how climate problems contributed to witch persecution provides warnings about how environmental crisis might be manipulated for political purposes. The legacy of witch persecution thus extends far beyond historical interest to provide frameworks for understanding contemporary challenges while offering both warnings about human capacity for systematic violence and inspiration from examples of resistance and reform. The flames that consumed accused witches centuries ago continue to illuminate present-day struggles for justice, equality, and human dignity. Understanding this legacy is essential for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary contexts while drawing on historical examples of both persecution and resistance to inform current efforts to promote human rights and social justice. The witch hunts serve as both warning and guide, demonstrating human capacity for both systematic cruelty and principled opposition to injustice. As the smoke clears from the pyres that consumed tens of thousands of innocent people across early modern Europe and colonial America, we are left with a stark and uncomfortable truth. The witch burnings were never really about witches at all. They were about power, control, economics, and the manipulation of fear for very earthly purposes. The flames that terrorized communities for over 3 centuries were kindled not by superstition alone, but by the calculated pursuit of political advantage, economic gain, and social domination. Throughout this investigation, we have peeled away the layers of myth and folklore that have long obscured the real reasons behind witch persecution. What emerges is a far more complex and disturbing picture than the simple narrative of medieval superstition overcoming reason. The witch hunts were sophisticated instruments of statecraft, economic redistribution, religious control, and social engineering that served the interests of those in power while devastating the lives of their victims and the communities that witnessed their suffering. The economic dimensions of witch persecution reveal perhaps the most cynical aspect of these campaigns. Time and again, we have seen how accusations of witchcraft serve to justify the confiscation of property, the elimination of economic competitors, and the redistribution of wealth from vulnerable individuals to powerful elites. The widow whose land was coveted by neighbors, the healer whose success threatened emerging medical professions, the woman whose independence challenged patriarchal norms, all became targets not because of any supernatural threat they posed, but because their elimination served concrete economic interests. The political manipulation of witch accusations demonstrates how persecution could serve state-building objectives while eliminating opposition and consolidating authority. From the prince-bishops of Germany who used witch trials to demonstrate their power and loyalty, to the English authorities who employed witch hunters during periods of civil conflict, we see how accusations of supernatural crime provided cover for very political objectives. The witch hunt became a tool of governance, a mechanism for managing social conflict while reinforcing existing power structures. The religious dimensions of witch persecution reveal the corruption of spiritual authority in service of temporal power. Rather than representing genuine theological concern about supernatural threats, witch hunts serve to consolidate religious authority, eliminate competing forms of spiritual practice, and demonstrate institutional power. The Church's role in promoting and justifying persecution shows how religious doctrine could be weaponized to serve political and economic objectives while maintaining moral legitimacy. The gendered nature of witch persecution exposes the systematic nature of patriarchal oppression and the ways that accusations of supernatural deviance could be used to control female autonomy. The overwhelming targeting of women, particularly those who challenged traditional gender roles or lived outside male protection, reveals how witch hunts serve to reinforce gender hierarchies, while eliminating women who threatened the established order. The legal corruption that enabled witch persecution demonstrates how institutional safeguards can be systematically undermined when they conflict with the objectives of powerful interests. The acceptance of torture, spectral evidence, and coerced confessions created legal frameworks that ensured conviction regardless of actual guilt or innocence. These corrupted procedures reveal how justice can be perverted to serve predetermined outcomes rather than discover truth. The social dynamics of witch persecution show how communities could be torn apart by fear and suspicion, while ordinary people became complicit in systematic violence. The breakdown of social trust, the turning of neighbors against neighbors, and the creation of climates where accusation became tantamount to conviction reveal the devastating social costs of persecution that extended far beyond individual victims. The regional variations in which persecution illuminate how different political, economic, and social conditions could intensify or moderate persecution, while revealing the adaptability of persecution mechanisms to local circumstances. From the systematic campaigns in German territories to the distinctive patterns in England and colonial America, we see how witch hunting could be tailored to serve different purposes while maintaining common underlying dynamics. The role of torture and confession in creating evidence reveals the mechanical production of proof to support predetermined, conclusions while demonstrating the human cost of corrupted justice. The systematic use of torture to extract confessions that confirmed prosecution. Narrative shows how violence could be institutionalized within legal systems while maintaining the appearance of legitimate procedure. The resistance and skepticism that challenged witch persecution demonstrate that alternatives were always possible, while showing how principled opposition could eventually overcome even systematic persecution. The intellectual, legal, and moral challenges to witch hunting that emerged over time provide models for resisting injustice while illustrating the importance of maintaining alternative voices during periods of widespread persecution. The decline of witch persecution reveals how multiple factors, intellectual development, legal reform, political stabilization, and social change, could converge to end systematic persecution while showing the gradual nature of cultural and institutional transformation. The eventual triumph of skepticism over superstition, evidence over accusation, and protection over persecution demonstrates the possibility of progress while revealing the complexity of social change. The legacy and modern implications of witch persecution continue to influence contemporary society while providing frameworks for understanding current forms of persecution, discrimination, and social control. The patterns revealed by witch hunting remain relevant for recognizing and resisting similar dynamics in modern contexts while honoring the memory of historical victims through continued commitment to justice and human rights. As we reflect on this dark chapter of human history, several crucial lessons emerge that remain painfully relevant today. First, we must recognize that persecution and scapegoating often serve concrete interests, while being justified through moral and ideological language. The witch hunts teach us to look beyond surface explanations for social violence, while examining the material interests that persecution serves. Second, we must understand how institutional corruption can transform systems designed to protect individuals into mechanisms of oppression. The legal systems that enabled witch persecution were not inherently evil, but were corrupted by the pursuit of predetermined outcomes. This reveals the importance of maintaining institutional integrity while resisting pressure to compromise legal protections for perceived security benefits. Third, we must acknowledge how economic insecurity and social upheaval can create conditions where scapegoating flourishes. The correlation between witch persecution and periods of economic hardship reveals how material conditions influence social dynamics while showing the importance of addressing root causes of social stress rather than seeking easy scapegoats. Fourth, we must recognize how fear can be manufactured and manipulated to serve political objectives. The witch hunts demonstrate how perceived threats can be amplified and distorted to justify exceptional measures while revealing the importance of maintaining critical thinking and institutional restraints even during periods of crisis. Fifth, we must understand how systematic persecution requires the complicity of ordinary people and institutions. The witch hunts could not have occurred without the participation of communities, legal systems, religious institutions, and intellectual authorities. This reveals the importance of individual and institutional resistance to injustice, while showing how persecution depends on widespread complicity. The transformation of ordinary conflicts into supernatural accusations reveals how societies under stress can create dangerous explanations for complex problems while seeking simple solutions through violence. The witch hunts show how communities can convince themselves that elimination of targeted groups will solve fundamental social problems while demonstrating the futility of scapegoating as a solution to systemic issues. The international scope of witch persecution demonstrates how ideas about persecution and social control can spread across boundaries, while showing the importance of international cooperation in resisting systematic oppression. The transnational networks that promoted witch hunting offer parallels to contemporary forms of organized persecution, while the international opposition that eventually emerged provides models for resistance. The documentation and study of witch persecution itself serves as a form of resistance to historical forgetting while providing tools for understanding and opposing contemporary injustice. The preservation of memory about systematic persecution serves educational and moral purposes while honoring victims through continued commitment to justice and human rights. As we conclude this investigation into the real reasons why witches were burned, we must acknowledge that we are confronting not just historical events, but ongoing human tendencies toward persecution, scapegoating, and the abuse of power. The witch hunts serve as a mirror reflecting both the worst and best of human nature, our capacity for systematic cruelty and principled resistance, institutional corruption and legal reform, social breakdown and community healing. The flames that consumed accused witches were ultimately lit by the same forces that drive persecution in any era: the pursuit of power and resources, the manipulation of fear for political purposes, the scapegoating of vulnerable populations during periods of crisis, and the willingness to sacrifice justice for perceived security. Understanding these dynamics is essential for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary contexts, while drawing on historical examples of resistance to inform current efforts to promote human rights and social justice. The story of witch persecution is ultimately a story about choices, the choices made by individuals, communities, and institutions when facing social stress and perceived threats. The witch hunts reveal how societies can choose persecution over justice, scapegoating over problem solving, and fear over compassion. But they also reveal how alternative choices are always possible, how resistance can emerge even under the most difficult circumstances, and how commitment to justice and human dignity can eventually triumph over systematic oppression. The memory of those who died in the witch hunts, the accused witches, who maintained their innocence under torture, the community members who tried to protect vulnerable neighbors, the intellectuals who challenged persecution at personal risk, serves as inspiration for continued resistance to injustice, while demonstrating the importance of maintaining alternative voices, even during periods of widespread persecution. As we honor their memory, we commit ourselves to understanding the forces that drove their persecution while working to prevent similar injustices in our own time. The real reason witches were burned was not supernatural evil, but human failing, the failure to protect the vulnerable, to maintain justice under pressure, and to resist the temptation to solve complex problems through the elimination of convenient scapegoats. By understanding this history, we equip ourselves to recognize similar patterns when they emerge, while drawing on the courage and wisdom of those who resisted persecution to inform our own efforts to promote justice, protect human rights, and build societies worthy of our highest aspirations. The flames of the witch hunts have long been extinguished, but their light continues to illuminate the ongoing struggle between oppression and liberation, persecution and justice, fear and hope. In that ongoing struggle, the voices of the past call us to vigilance, resistance, and unwavering commitment to the dignity of every human being. Their sacrifice was not in vain if we learned from their suffering while working to ensure that such systematic persecution never again masquerades as justice, never again destroys communities in the name of protection, and never again silences the innocent under the guise of moral necessity. The witch hunts are over, but the human capacity for both persecution and resistance remains. How we choose to use that capacity, whether to build systems of oppression or liberation, exclusion or inclusion, fear or hope, will determine whether the lessons of history serve as warnings or guides for a more just and humane future.